I'm here to tell you about the strange occurrences that happened to my mother at the Lawrence family mansion on Teddington Park Avenue in Toronto. The first thing you need to know is that my mom is a down-to-earth, no-nonsense type, and she believes that the house was, as all its tenants have believed in the past, that it is haunted. My mom lived in an apartment, dirt cheap because it was haunted, at the top of the mansion. It was, she says, extremely beautiful. High vaulted ceilings, many rooms, and spacious too. In the kitchen, there was a mirror called the talking mirror. This was because anybody who stayed in the kitchen long enough started randomly talking to themselves in the mirror. My mother says no matter who passed it, they started to babble. My mom even talked to herself without realizing it, until something brought her attention back to where she was and what she was doing, making her realize that she had been talking to herself. On the bottom floor, a German man named Hans, I don't know how to spell it, he was the most serious man my mom had ever known. My mom visited him sometimes, and oftentimes she would go into this bathroom that was there and just study the CLW footed tub that dated back to the 1930s. She got the most creepy feeling looking at it, like she could almost see a body lying in it. She compared it to the portrait of Murder of Merit, which is a painting of a man with his throat and wrist slit. She told the man, and he said that he heard noises coming from it at night, and that he knew it must have been haunted, because he said you could almost see the outline of a body in it. They looked into the history of the home, and sure enough, somebody had hurt themselves in the tub around the 1950s. Another thing near the bathroom was a hall, where people would say they felt a deep desire to run to get down it, and that before going down it, you had to stop and brace yourself, getting up your courage, like there was a wall there stopping you from going that you had to get through. Another place in the house was a great living room. It was in the apartment of a policeman and his girlfriend. They always argued, mostly in that room. And one night, the girlfriend took the man's gun and held it to his head as they argued. People always reported that happy couples would always go into that room and just start arguing. Cold spots were numerous in the house. I could tell you many other stories about various spots, but I have to get going. My mom says the house is sold for over $5 million, and that she suspects that someone tore the house down to get rid of the hauntings and build a replica. My name is Lindsay. I've lived with my family in this home for 4 years now, and ever since we've lived here, we've experienced some things. It seems though that most things have happened in my bedroom, and I often thought my parents did not believe the things I had told them about. The first month of living in my home, my mother awoke in the morning to find a painting of a woman. This painting was lying on the floor in the closet. It appeared overnight. She had questioned all of us in the home, and nobody had seen it before. The music boxes would play randomly in the middle of the night. Doorknobs, turning seconds before turning them yourself. My bedroom door always sounded like it was opening by itself, when it was really shut. It wasn't for a while when I actually started to see people, or should I say ghosts, in my room while I was sleeping. I have seen a translucent woman wearing brown rags several times. The first I'd ever seen her, she was standing at the foot of my bed with her mouth wide open, as if she was screaming, but I never heard a sound. It felt as though my heart had stopped. I was frozen with fear. I had rolled over and told myself it wasn't actually there, and that I was seeing things. Then about a month later, The same lady sat in my chair, in my room, just watching me. I then covered my face with my pillow and went back to sleep. In the morning, I told my mother about both times this lady being in my room, and she just mocked me. She just kind of laughed and joked about it. She told me that the first time that the lady was there, it was because her teeth hurt, because I'm planning on becoming a dentist after schooling. I didn't think my mom believed me at all. Sometime after that, a tall man stood next to the head of my bed, once again, just staring at me. When I awoke, I started screaming, and my mother came running into my room. She told me it was just a dream and to go back to bed, but I knew it wasn't. She was just saying what parents would say, just to make me feel better. It was strange how my room was the only room I'd ever seen them in. My family would just make fun of me and would make stupid jokes about the ghost in my room. Later one night, my sister was across the hall from me sleeping when she woke to a flash that lit up the room at 1 a.m. This was when she was 20. She then ran into my room and slept next to me. She was not sure that it was a flash from a camera, since we were upstairs and everyone was sleeping. We never figured what the flash was. When my mother was away on vacation, and I was the only one home, I was sleeping, and when I woke in the middle of the night, I found myself eye to eye with a young girl who had to have been at least 10. She had a wound in her head where I had been. Terrifyingly, there was a hole through her head. It was the right eye that had been gone. This was the most frightening thing I'd ever seen. I once again couldn't do anything. I was the only one home, so I laid there and went back to sleep. Once again, I see the woman lady, except this time, I find myself fighting her in my dream. The weird thing was, a mobile that was hanging above me on my ceiling had fallen and hit me in the stomach while I was sleeping. I still found that my parents didn't believe me until one night, my dad went downstairs for a drink at 1 a.m. That's when he heard some girl humming a song. He thought it was me, until he realized that he and my mom were the only ones home that night. Later the same night at 3 a.m, my mother awoke and had to use the restroom. While she was walking down the hall, she heard a lady talking. My parents told me about this when I arrived home the next morning, and now they believe me. We don't know about who these ghosts are, but we are trying to find some history about our house, as it was built in 1890. Maybe the history will reveal who these ghosts are and why they are there. I grew up in a typical Maryberry-ish small southern town in southeast Tennessee. Our home was less than 80 feet from the Norfolk Southern Railroad line. The tracks were on a rise in the hill, and from the second-story window of our home, you would be parallel with the tracks. The town I grew up in was once a coal mining camp, and then grew to be a coal mining town. Point of fact, the town's name came from the original proprietor of the first train depot. It was called Daisy, after his only daughter. From my house, the original train depot was situated just about a mile north, and the area of the train tracks in between was often referred to as Black Track because there were several curves in the railway, and coal was often spilled in these curves, leaving the soil covered in the black, chalky coal residue. It is purportedly haunted, and there are several ghastly and ghostly tales attributed to that area of track. From what I'm able to gather, One story is that a female slave was once accused of leading other slaves to freedom via the train tracks, and when her trajectory was discovered by her owner, she was tied to the tracks until a train came through, chopping off both of her feet. Once this was done, she was carried to the slave quarters as an example of what would happen to all others who attempted escape or assisted others in escaping. Slowly she bled to death, despite the other slaves' best effort. I know several people who have laid their hands on the Bible today and testify seeing her feetless body in the area. Another story is about a train wreck that happened about 15 yards from the back door of my old home. In southern Tennessee, we do not get much snow, but we can get quite a bit of rain. Apparently in the late 30s, a weather front came through, bringing a lot of rain and flash flooding to the area. One night after the rain had slowed to a drizzle, a fully loaded train was slowing to stop at the depot, not knowing that the ground below was giving way under its weight. During the initial wreck, several railroad workers and hobos were trapped in the rubble. Many of the rescuers were local farmers and residents who perished as the mud shifted under the weight of the debris, and ultimately, a large land and debris slide halted all rescue efforts. As many as 50 people perished, and the old-timers would say that they could hear people moaning and screaming for help for days after the wreck, and how help never came. Some people swear that they could hear the sorrowful screams and moans of the trapped on bright, still nights. Lastly, another story about the area tracks has to do with teenage hormones and stupidity. Along the section of track is an old paved road that weaves back and forth across the tracks. In the 50s and 60s, this area of road was used by teenagers to prove the muscle in their machines and the guts in their drivers. More than one person has perished in their efforts to outrun the train. Many people say that those untimely deaths are the culprits of strange flashes of light that are often seen in that area. I am new to this site, and I've read many of the stories posted. I wanted to share my experiences. For the past 5 years, myself, my son who is turning 6, and my daughter who will be 2 this fall, have lived in a small cottage-style house with a full basement. The first weekend that I moved in, I of course had a party. My son stayed with my parents for the night. I also had a roommate for the first 2 months that I moved into the home. She had a cordless phone in the basement, and I had a regular phone upstairs. After our guests left for the evening, I took the cordless phone upstairs to make some calls. When I went to bed, I left the phone on the floor in my room. The next morning, I heard someone walking up the basement stairs. My bed was on the other side of the wall that led to the basement. I heard the footsteps walk through the kitchen, small dining room, and into the living room. I had my bedroom door shut, and I tried to call out to my roommate to tell her to come in. I thought that she was looking for the phone. It was then that I realized that I couldn't open my eyes, move, or even speak. I heard the footsteps pass through my doorway. The door never opened. I noticed that the closer they got to my bed, that the floor appeared to be shaking, hence the shaking ghost. The only auditory comparison I can give is it sounded like when my dad would do laundry and tried to cram 20 pairs of jeans in a washer that had 5. The whole machine would shake, and you could hear it all over the house. The bathroom floor would even vibrate. That is what it felt like to me. I realized that whatever it was standing over me, and soon I felt a hand resting on my hip. It was just a gentle pressure. I think that he was trying to see who was in the house. At that moment, I was extremely terrified and still couldn't move, speak, or even open my eyes. There was a banging on my window. The noise stopped, and whatever had touched me let go. I jumped out of bed, and there was nothing in the room. Apparently, my dad had been standing outside for 10 minutes banging on the door. I never heard him pull into the driveway, which is right outside my window, or knock on the door. He also said that he tried to call us, and I'd never heard the phone ring. I never had this happen again, until just 2 nights ago. My daughter and I share a room, and around 2 in the morning, she woke up. I could hear her cry out, "Mama," and I tried to get up. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move anything but to lift my head off the pillow briefly. I realized that the floor was shaking again. I tried to open my eyes to look at it, and I couldn't. I believed that it was looking to the crib at my daughter. I didn't feel anything evil, but I don't think it wanted me to see it. After about 5 minutes, the shaking stopped, and my daughter was back asleep. It all happened so strange that I even considered that I was maybe dreaming it all. When I checked the crib, my daughter seemed fine, and nothing was out of place. Some other just normal haunting things I've experienced are footsteps in cabinets open when I know that I'd left them closed. The ghost seems to like my kids, and likes to check up on them. I smoke, so during the winter when it is cold, I go down into the basement and smoke by the back cellar steps. I have often heard footsteps go from one bedroom to another, but they never go back out of the last room they entered. Also, when my daughter was in her baby swing, anytime I went downstairs, I would hear footsteps walk over to the swing and stop. They are always too heavy and slow to be my son's. Also, whenever I hear them and go back upstairs, he is soundly asleep in his room, so I know that it was never my son. There have been a few times, though, that I felt that I was unwelcome in the basement. I feel like I'm being watched in there, and that something doesn't like me to be there. I have also felt that feeling walking past my kitchen at night. It's like something is standing there watching me, and this thing seems very cold. I've never been harmed or felt completely threatened by anything. My son has complained of being scared, but if he has seen or heard anything, he doesn't tell me. I just wanted to share my story. We are moving in a month, so it'll be interesting to see if the people that end up renting my house have any experiences too. When I was about 6 or 7, I woke up in the middle of the night for a strange reason. I had a loft bed, and I had looked down in my closet. As I was looking, I saw my bead curtains that were hanging over my closet starting to sway. I then felt something brush the side of my arm. I flipped out and almost ran into my parents' room. About halfway to my parents' room, I came to the realization that maybe my fan was on. When I went back to my room, I noticed that my fan had been unplugged the whole time. I knew then that my curtains were definitely moving on their own. I didn't even own any pets, so I had no logical explanation for what had happened. I remember always seeing someone in the corner of my eye. I would turn to see who it was, but when I did, no one was there. Things would disappear, such as homework and school supplies. Then they would reappear on the kitchen counter and on my dresser. I would always feel someone is watching me. Then I turned around to see that no one was there. I remember one time in particular, I had a friend sleep over. We were up in my tree fort, and it was dark out, and we were hiding inside. We had dared each other to turn off our flashlights so that it was pitch black. We were getting ready to open the side door when a pair of red eyes appeared on the door window. We rushed inside and started to shake from fright. I have moved from that house 5 weeks ago and have lived in that house for 7 years. I'm glad not to be in that house anymore. I feel a presence here, but I don't know if it's good or bad. Watching my mom slowly disappear from this earth was one of the hardest things I've ever had to go through in my life. All the sleepless nights spent by her bedside, reassuring her that my love for her would never die, even though she was in the process of it. Words cannot even begin to describe what it felt to be in that hospital, watching her soul slowly slip away from her body. And it was in those dying moments when I was finally able to process what took so many years to fully comprehend: that she was love, and I never truly knew what I had. For the years before I lost her, I'd often wonder what love was exactly. Was it just a figment of my imagination? Was it this elusive ghost that its presence I'd never be able to feel? It was nowhere to be seen. Even if I did see it, would my eyes even believe it? That's it. That's the line. Love to me was a ghost. I'd always hear stories of it. Those who have sworn they felt it. But did it really exist? The loss of my mother changed all of that, because love is watching someone die. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a scholar or a teacher. In fact, I'd say I'm pretty dim-witted, but that was the journey I took to reach the stellar conclusion. It's just a shame that it came at a time when I was at my weakest and most vulnerable stage. But as they say, hindsight is 20/20. It's just that I had learned so much from the grieving process that I was finally able to piece together the puzzle. Since Mom left, I also began to realize something else: that love returns to comfort, even in the paranormal. Funny, I'm a skeptic, and I've always been. There were a few moments after my mom's passing that I really began to realize that she really didn't leave me. I'm writing these ghost events because I want people to know that our souls do live on even after death. Because what happened to me was true evidence that the afterlife is so very real. Sure, we never know for certain, but I hope after reading my story, you will be more convinced that there is another dimension where people travel to. My son had never met my mom before. In fact, she passed away years before he had a chance to. But yet, from an early age, he started having these visitations that I always used to dismiss as just a kid's imagination. At first, it was always just things he'd hear at night, like a faint humming in his bedroom, and the sounds of a woman's voice. My son was 12 at the time, but he always insisted that there was someone else living in the bedroom with him. Then, my son would start to tell me that there was an old lady living in his closet. After a while, it really got to be too much for him, and he started to refuse sleeping in his room. He insisted every time, and I refused to believe that there was a woman's eyes just showing up in the closet. It wasn't a comfortable feeling to him, because he felt this woman's energy as something truly demonic, as in it wasn't just watching, but almost waiting for something. "Dad," he'd say, "there's an old lady that wants to possess my soul." The more events that he swore happened, the more I started to grow concerned after dismissing it before. As a concerned parent, my initial thoughts were not that he was seeing a ghost, but that he was having a mental breakdown. Maybe my son was going through an episode of psychosis and even developing schizophrenia. So I went to get him a psychological evaluation, and oddly enough, all tests came back fine. There really wasn't anything going on with him. He still maintained that there was something in his room, so it was time for me to trade rooms with him to see what he was on about. I have to mention though, that nothing else was going on in my house until this happened. This is also part of the reason why I'd always dismiss my son and think it was an imagination. Kids generally have imaginary friends, or sometimes tell stories for attention. But at the age of 12, I honestly genuinely thought so. After a while though, that narrative ended up dissolving, and something else took its place, that possibly something paranormal was going on. And that was what I was trying to find out. I ended up sleeping in my son's room for about a month, and for the first couple of weeks, there were no signs of activity anywhere in the room. It actually felt a bit peaceful. The odd thing was, when I finally felt something in the room, I really felt it to an extreme. It was like it hit me like a ton of bricks, and I wasn't able to shake the feeling off at all. It was almost like having the flu. I started to feel weak and uneasy, and for a few days, I felt this pressure on my chest, as if something was sitting on me, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The scariest moment came a few days after Valentine's Day. I was sleeping in my son's room, late at night, when I felt as if someone was breathing on my face. I then awoke, and I literally saw the closet door open completely and slowly. Luckily, I didn't see anything, but it did alarm me to the point in which I began to believe my son a little more. Maybe not about an old lady, as he said, but that something unkind was living in this room. I still kept sleeping in there until a few months later, when I had to call a priest into the room to bless it, and had a medium come over as well. When I was always a completely level-headed person, who always stayed composed, I would lash out at my brother and my sister when they were over, and one day I got into a verbal altercation that I didn't even remember having with my sister. I threw her up against a wall and told her that she needed to fear me, and kept threatening her. I then went to sleep. It was about 8 p.m. and woke up, and my sister had told me what I did, and I was completely unaware. When I woke up, I really had no memory of that happening. I just remember blacking out and waking up in a bed a couple hours later. She told me what I did, and I apologized to her immediately. That's when she said that you need to get a medium and a priest in here. There is something sinister living in your home, and it's not safe for your son to be living here. So a priest came in and blessed the home, and so did the medium. I told the medium about my son and what he experienced, and everything that happened to me. The medium came to the conclusion that the woman in the closet was actually a fallen angel who was trying to possess me. I told her that maybe it was my mom in the closet, but she rejected the idea. The old woman in the closet, her theory, was appearing as my mom, because that's what fallen angels or demons do. They deceive and trick. After all that, nothing happened. It was quite peaceful, and my son and I had never experienced anything else. I really wonder why this fallen angel decided to appear in our home. Was she feeding off the negative energy of the morning of my mother? Maybe my mother was there to protect me. Who knows? The stories I'm about to tell you are pretty creepy. It's about fallen angels. To me, fallen angels are more like demons who were originally rejected from heaven, were sent down to create havoc and chaos for those who are vulnerable and easy to manipulate. They are a category of ghosts that I believe are quite possibly the scariest form you could ever encounter. You may find this hard to believe, but I will tell you anyway, because quite frankly, I don't give a dang who doesn't believe me. It was when I used to work third shift at a grocery store, stocking items overnight, and oftentimes, I'd take the back roads home and would often pass by the old wooden bridge that dates back years and years. This happened in Minnesota. I can remember that it was snowing extremely hard that night, and I had just gotten into a pretty bad argument with my now ex-girlfriend. I was supposed to stay the night at her house just to call off for work, because the roads were terrible. I went to her house just before it started snowing really hard to take back some items that I had left there. I wasn't about to stay with her after a couple days, because a couple days ago, she had cheated on me, but she insisted that I just spend the night and try to forget what happened, which I think is ridiculous, but it is what it is. So I take off to go home. The blizzard was just getting bad at this point, and I had trouble driving through it, especially on these dirt roads, but I was doing the best I could. At this point, there isn't a soul within miles, literally driving on the road, with a bridge that doesn't have anything around. No stores, buildings, homes, etc. Literally just an open country road, and it just kept snowing and snowing. I have my brights focused on the road, and that's when I see two young men just standing in front of the road, staring at my car from afar. I mean, this made no sense, because again, as I said, there was nothing around them at all for them to even be there. No other cars present, no shops, buildings, etc. There was just that bridge behind me, and an open road. Even though it was snowing, it did seem like they were solid people to me. Well, anyway, I start to get really scared. I was thinking that maybe these two young men were going to try and ambush me. So even though it was snowing like crazy, I ended up slamming on the gas and driving right past them. I was thinking that they wouldn't want to get hit by the car, so they would move away immediately. So I pushed the gas forward, knowing how dangerous it already is with the road. And I'm going faster, and they aren't moving. So I'm driving, and I ended up driving through them. They did not move out of the way, and I pulled over for a second after that, looked behind me, maybe thinking for a split second that maybe I did hit them, and I saw absolutely no one. They were gone. It happened so quick, and there was no evidence at all that they were even there. I tried to check if there were any footprints, but I looked around, and I couldn't find any at all. Either way, I wasn't going to stay around longer on the road to see if they could come back, so I ended up driving off. The weird thing was, as I was looking at my gas tank, I was nearly running on empty. Before I even left my ex, my tank had full gas. There's no way that in the 15 minutes that I drove from my ex's house to my own house, that it would take almost all my gas to get there. It just doesn't add up, even with the blizzard going on. The crazy part was, when I got home, I went to sleep, and the next day, my ex had called me. She was frantic. She said that she felt like someone was breaking into her house last night. She said she kept seeing shadows right outside her back door, moving back and forth in the middle of the night. Big shadows that made it seem that whatever was trying to break in was at least 7 feet tall. But it really made no sense, because why would someone do that in the middle of a blizzard? I told her my own story about what had happened to me, and she suggested that I spend the night with her, just to keep her safe. So for the next few days, even if I was apprehensive about it, I stayed at her house. I would simply just go to work from her house every night and come back, but nothing would happen. That was until I came back on the 4th night I was staying there, and she had told me something really weird had happened. I told her what, and she said that when she was sleeping in her room, she told me that she saw a shadow figure with wings just standing in the hallway at night. She told me she heard a loud noise in the hallway, got up, opened the door, and at the end of the hallway, that's where she saw it. It then moved away pretty quickly and disappeared. Knowing what happened to me before, I didn't call her crazy or think she was imagining things. I believed her, and that's where the stories end. This is why I bring up the fallen angel theory, because I believe that because of the cheating, the winter storm, and all the anger and bad energy floating around, I believe that this fallen angel appeared to make things even worse. It almost seemed like it wanted something bad to happen to us, but nothing really did. Again, I know this is hard to believe, but after you've truly witnessed something like this, maybe you change your mind. Whatever the case, it was creepy, and I have my own thoughts and beliefs about what was going on here. This is a story in which I'm not entirely sure if it was sleep paralysis or something much more sinister, but it is pretty terrifying. Fallen angel ghost encounters, you decide for yourself. In 1985, 3 friends and I moved to our first home outside of the dorms at Oregon College in Eugene, Oregon. We had found a great duplex. It was close to school, roomy, comfortable, and best of all, it was cheap. The house was older. Downstairs there were 3 rooms, a door to the basement, and stairways in the front and the back of the home, leading to 3 bedrooms and a bath upstairs. Immediately we noticed that the place was eerie, especially the basement and the back stairway. We kept the basement door locked. The problems began immediately. Many mornings, we woke to find the previously locked basement door open. The back stairwell was terrifying. Some of us took to walking down the stairway sideways because we felt that somebody was going to push us down. There was a frequent, very cold spot at the top of the stairwell, although there was no windows nearby, and the darkness at the top of the stairs felt downright malicious. Whatever resided there seemed to strongly dislike the woman in our household. Light shades from ceiling fixtures have come crashing down a few times when she was around, but it wouldn't ever happen to us. After each time this happened, we tightened the rest of the fixtures, only to have it happen again a few weeks later. Another time she had to go down to the basement, and when she was going down there, she heard a very deep groan coming out of nowhere. She called out, just to make sure there wasn't anyone down there. That's when we asked her if she was okay, and realized we were all upstairs. She swore that she heard a really aggressive groan there. Another time, and this only happened to her, she awoke to a black mass choking her in the middle of the night. She woke up, and it was gone, disappeared, nowhere to be found at all. It just didn't make much sense at all. She even had a dream where 2 angels were fighting with each other. One was completely dressed in black, and the other was light. She told us it was a quick dream, and she woke up immediately, but that really affected her. Over time, we stopped spending any time alone in the home because of the constant feeling of being watched or followed. Friends stopped coming over. One even refused to even come onto the front porch because the house frightened him so much. I slept in the front room upstairs. It was the brightest room in the home, but it wasn't fear of the fear that the rest of the house seemed to generate. I began to suffer from my terrors. Was it the stress of school? I wondered. Or the energy of the place? As I fell asleep, I saw either spiders or a severed hand scudding across my bed towards me, frightening me so badly I jumped out of bed screaming. I couldn't bear the night terrors. After some research, I decided to bless my room using salt and holy water. I told the spirits that the house was theirs, but the room was mine. I kept a line of salt across my threshold at all times. Perhaps it was a placebo, but the night terrors never happened after the blessing. But from time to time at night, I'd glance up from my studies. He stood right at the door, looking into my room. I could see a hat, a jawline, shoulders and chest. I'm talking about this ghost. To me, it didn't feel particularly sentient, and I could often gather the fortitude to close the door in his missing face. It was this figure, maybe, that had been terrorizing the woman before, but it just felt unusual. This is why I believe it to be a fallen angel ghost. Everything just seemed to add up this way, because it was a very bad energy and experience that couldn't be lifted for a very long time. We've lived in this home for 2 very frightening years. I've experienced some ghostly places since, but I've never since had night terrors. I don't know whether the house is still standing or what experiences other tenants have had. Hi, I live in Worcester, Massachusetts. My house was originally built by my grandparents, where there used to be dirt roads and farms all over the place, way back in the day. It's been here for at least 40 plus years, and on some occasions when I'm home alone, I feel a presence, particularly in my mother's bedroom. This only happens sometimes. One of the scariest moments came after playing with a Ouija board with my little brother there. I remember we were curious to see if our grandparents were still with us, and since I was a big believer in ghosts, I wanted to see more signs of the afterlife. We were playing, and the letters spelled out evil and angel every time if we asked if something was there. It simply terrified the both of us, but we still wanted to find out more. I remember also getting a spirit box, those really old Japanese recorders, and every time we'd record in that room, and this only happened in this room, you'd hear a very loud growl. We would ask, "Who are you?" And even another time, I'd get a voice saying evil angel. It was spooky to hear spelled out on the Ouija board and heard on the spirit recorder. One night, my mother was reading and no one else was in the room, and she heard a voice whisper, "Kathy." She came into my bedroom and thought it was me, but I was on the computer. I don't know of anyone passing away in this home to my knowledge, but sometimes I feel watched in my own home. It's very weird. We were starting to put the pieces together, that this could be a fallen angel or a demon. I have this weird shed in my backyard that hasn't been used in years. It's located in the woods over a stone wall, and whenever I just walk in there, even during the day, I feel a presence that warns me to go away from there. This happens when I step over the stone wall and into the woods. I automatically feel like I shouldn't be here, or to go away. One night in the fall, I stood right near the stone wall listening, and I swear I could hear someone walking in the leaves very slowly. And sometimes, I feel a very chilling cold wind, sometimes when I'm walking in that woods. Of course, I've felt presences like that before. I've also driven slowly past a road nearby, and I felt a strong presence of something when I was just driving by, like I shouldn't be there. It's a weird dirt road, and the street sign is scratched out. It's very strange. Some of my family has reported driving down the road and seeing dark shadows dart across it, before disappearing quickly into the woods. Come to think of it, that road in my house has always just felt like some sort of negative presence was always there. But at the same time, there was still this comfort. Like whatever was going on was in constant conflict between good and evil. Maybe I'm just projecting because of the events that happened to us, but it still felt like something that was really going on. I've also experienced seeing the orb phenomenon, and it only happens in some places outside or inside my home. When I take a picture with my smartphone, I know it's easy to fake photos, especially in this day and age, but the orb photos are insane, and it gives me further proof that something does live here. At my friend's house up the street, deep in her backyard, there is a well. One time she swore to me that she saw the head of an old man peeking out from the well, though I can't confirm this because it didn't happen to me. I don't think my friend has any reason to lie, so if she saw something like that, I'm inclined to believe it. Just wonder why though. Why the well, out of all places? If there was a ghost, why would it be hanging out there? Or maybe, as I said, it goes back to being a fallen angel or a demon. Well, it turns out, we did find out that years ago in the 19th century, a kid had fallen down the well and perished. I know I heard about this happening before in another place in Massachusetts that has had a history of bad hauntings, but I just find it fascinating that it also happened in this well too. Maybe this stuff happened a lot back then. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the story. None of this was fabricated, and I hate having to say this because I wish I could just tell this story without people always doubting. But I do understand that it's super easy to lie about these types of things. Rest assured, this is all true. If you choose not to believe, it's your choice.
Hello. When I was a young kid, we lived in Southwest Philadelphia. I think I was about 4. I was sick. I woke up one night because I felt my bed moving. When I looked up, there was 4 shadowy people around my bed, rocking it. They had no faces, and they didn't look like they had clothes on. I don't know what the purpose of this was, but I wasn't scared. I just looked at them and went back to sleep. Another time, I was sitting on a landing and looked up the steps, and I saw 2 shadows running back and forth. It looked like they were playing tag. I was never afraid of these things. I didn't feel like they would hurt me, but when I would go up the steps by myself, I remember feeling like someone was watching me, but nothing ever happened to me. They weren't mean, as far as I could tell. I didn't realize they were ghosts until I was much older and didn't live in the house anymore. My mother grew up in the house. She had some experiences, but nothing she would ever really go into detail about. The only experience that I remember she would talk about was after her grandmother died. She died in the house. Her dog started going nuts in the middle room. He was looking at the middle of the room and jumping up and down. Maybe he saw my great-grandmother. I don't think she really believed in it. I know my uncle, who also grew up there, had some experiences. He told me once he was sleeping in my room, the middle room, when it got real cold, and he felt like something was in there with him, and he didn't know what. Sometimes, I still have dreams or nightmares about the house. I haven't lived in it for over 20 years. Pretty weird, huh? I don't know how many ghosts or spirits or what have you were in the house, but I'm sure there were many, and they were probably still there and still doing their thing. They just didn't seem to hurt or scare me. Maybe my great-grandmother kept them from hurting us. Who knows? My grandfather passed away last March, and I've long since been grieving his departure. After my grandfather died, my grandmother was left to live alone in her large house just outside of Irons, Michigan. My uncle and 2 cousins came up from Indiana to visit us for a week this past summer. My sister and I were staying at my grandmother's to help take care of my cousins. One night, we were having a bonfire in my grandmother's yard, which lies right on a lake. I, the only one sitting next to the fire, was thinking about my grandfather and all the things we used to do together. My grandmother and sister were sitting back on the patio, watching the fire from there and talking to my cousins and uncle who were in the house behind a screen door playing video games. As if he were reading my mind, my cousin made a comment about my grandfather. "Will grandfather ever come back, Grandma?" he asked. The question sent a sharp pain through my heart. "No, Jimmy," answered my grandmother. "Grandpa is always with us. Even though you can't see him, he's here in spirit." Of course, my cousin didn't understand this, being only 4 years old, so he continued with the questions, then quieted and continued to play his video game. I sat still, staring at the warm fire, remembering the times I'd look at my grandfather and see him smiling at the blazing warmth. Just then, I got a strange feeling, an urge to look over at the flag, towering high over me in the fire. It was completely calm. There was no wind, not even enough to slightly blow a small leaf resting upon the ground. As I looked up at the flag, I remember when my grandfather would come out every morning and raise the flag to the top of the flagpole and salute it, smiling as he did so. He was so patriotic. He loved his country and fought as hard as he could for it while he was in the army during World War II. I gazed at the beautiful red, white, and blue colors of our country's flag as it lay impaling, hugging the flagpole. Just then, the flag rose and spread out completely straight. My heart jumped as I knew there was no wind to make this happen. I heard my grandmother mutter, "Thank you, Carrie." I looked back at her and she just smiled. Later I learned that my grandmother had said a prayer to my grandfather. She had said, "Carrie, if you are here with us, if you are protecting over these children, please give me a sign." That was when she saw as I had. The flag that he loved so much spread out straight. From that moment on, I knew that my grandfather was standing with me, protecting me, and I know, to this day, he still is. One of my older brothers, Tim, was born with a veil over his face. According to the old wives' tales, this means he would be able to see things that others couldn't. This was proven one April night in 1986. Being the youngest of 7 and only 18, I still lived at home when my mother got ill. My oldest sister Penny and Tim had come down to our house because they were concerned about my mom being sick. Well, the night Penny arrived, we all sat around laughing and having a good time. We all then decided to watch a movie. It was called Nightmare on Elm Street. About halfway through the movie, Tim said, "Isn't someone going to answer the door?" Since he likes to pull jokes, we all laughed at him and said, "I sure bet it's Freddy Krueger." But he was very adamant that there was someone knocking at the door. We all looked out the window, and there was nobody there. "It's a woman with shoulder-length hair, wearing a black dress. She's right there on the steps." Tim kept insisting, and finally he got up and went outside. When he came back in, he said he couldn't find her, and she must have left. We didn't think twice about it until the next day. My mother got worse, so my dad and Penny took her to the hospital, which was 60 miles away. Since he likes to pull jokes, we all laughed at him and said, "I sure bet it's Freddy Krueger." But he was very adamant that there was someone knocking at the door. We all looked out the window, and there was nobody there. "It's a woman with shoulder-length hair, wearing a black dress. She's right there on the steps." Tim kept insisting, and he finally got up and went outside. When he came back in, he said he couldn't find her, and she must have left. We didn't think twice about it until the next day. My mother got worse, so my dad and Penny took her to the hospital, which was 60 miles away. About 2 hours after they left, Penny, who has shoulder-length hair, called us and said to come right away, that her dad had collapsed in the ER. Tim and I get ready to leave, but before we could, Penny called to say her dad was having a heart attack. So Tim and I got in our cars and raced down there. When we got there, Penny met us at the door and told our dad was dead, and they had already taken him to the morgue. Being in shock, We didn't connect Tim's sighting of the woman in black at the door with what was happening, but Tim's sightings weren't finished yet. About a month after my dad was buried, Tim and his wife had gone to the cemetery to check on the headstone that was supposed to have been placed that week. They were checking the headstone to make sure the information on it was correct. Tim said to his wife, "Look, there's a man dressed like Dad sitting up there on that bench." My dad had been a farmer, so he always wore overalls and a straw hat if he was working outside. At first they didn't think anything of it, because the town where my dad is buried is a farming community, so there's a lot of people dressed that way. Then the man started walking towards them, but no matter how close they got, they could never even see his face, even though the hat wasn't covering it. Then Tim started to think it was Dad, so he walked towards the man and said, "Dad?" The man turned around and started walking away, and they couldn't even catch him, even though the man only walked and they ran. He finally disappeared at the edge of the cemetery, which was nothing but a line of trees on the edge of a creek with a plant, a factory, a few hundred yards behind that. When Tim told us about the man in the graveyard, everyone thought he was just missing my dad, until I pointed out that there are no benches anywhere in that cemetery. I once had a very scary experience that will haunt me for life. It was Super Bowl 96, and my family and I were at a party at my cousin's house. My cousin has a graveyard in the back of her house. She had just moved in and was telling us about stuff that had happened to her since she had moved in. We decided to explore the graveyard that night. In the graveyard, there was a church, an old abandoned church. We figured they kept the families in there who had died. We got a flashlight to look in the windows. We were looking around in the windows when suddenly my cousin gasped and looked up. We all looked up, and in the top window was a pale face looking down at us. She was so pale and sickly, her hair was dangling over her eyes. She was faded, but we could see her. When we saw her, we bolted. We screamed all the way back to the house. After a while, we were brave enough to go back to see what happened. When we got there, the doors that were boarded up and vined were totally open. We ran back and never went back there again. And if you don't believe me, don't, because I know it is true. There are some scary things that haunt us that we will never understand, and this is definitely one of them. I'm young, but have had my run of bad luck. When I was 8, 2 of my dearest friends were shot minutes after I had left the woods. Sandy, Claire, and I were in the woods in the summer. We had fallen asleep in the treehouse when all of a sudden, I was woken up by a noise. Sandy turned to me in her sleep and told me to run away as fast as I could. I was shocked and did not want to leave, but then she screamed at me. I took off running into the woods. I stopped and turned around to hear 2 gunshots and screams. They had been shot in their sleep. 3 years later, I was talking on the phone with a friend, and I noticed my dog staring at the corner of the room where I had a picture of my friends and I in the woods. I turned and saw a shadow in the window of a little girl. I told my friend about what I saw. I kept watching. It turned to me and said, run fast." My friend on the phone asked who was that. I turned off the phone and ran out of the house just as a window was broken in the house by a man with a gun. I ran next door and I called the police. This may not be one of the more exciting tales that you've heard, but I assure you that it's true. My name is Lindsay, and I am 16 years old. My best friend has claimed to be a psychic, and has proven his ability several times. He enjoys freaking me out by reading my mind, and knowing what I am doing while I talk to him on the phone. He told me that he used to have guardian ghosts when he was little, that only appeared by his bedside when he was woken up by nightmares. However, as I do not know the whole story behind his ghost, I am writing about a different instance where his powers came in handy. One more note on him. He can astral project, meaning that he can send his presence places while his body is sitting comfortably at home. He has only done this with me once, when I was upset and crying while I was on the phone with him. Now for my experience. I was on the phone with my best friend, as usual. It was about midnight, and we had been having a very serious conversation. I was getting very upset and was curled up on my bed with the phone. We had both been silent for about a minute when I felt a presence in my room. I said, "You're here, aren't you?" thinking that he projected himself into my room. He told me that it wasn't him. Suddenly, I was hit with a feeling of pure hatred and evil. Though I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, I knew exactly where the thing was. I huddled into the corner of my bed as I slowly became hysterical, saying, "There's something here. Get it out. It's here, and it's bad." He told me to block my mind and that he would help me. I kept saying, it's here, until he almost yelled at me. "No, it's not, Lindsay. It's here." I've never heard him say anything that angrily. We were silent again for about 2 or 3 minutes, until I worked up the courage to ask him what happened. He said that it was gone, that he had fought it off, whatever it was. We decided that our serious conversation had probably just opened up a window to some bad karma and had manifested itself in almost physical form. For the next few days, I avoided my room as much as possible. We decided to keep the serious conversations to a minimum for a while. I've had several experiences with entities, mostly I believe evil. They seem to be attracted to me. When I was about 5 to 8, my sister had a poster of E.T. that I was deathly afraid of. Its eyes would follow me, and I feel like I saw it wink. I think it might be a spirit working through it. When we moved from the house, I had the guts to rip it in half. Incidentally, my sister told me that last year she was deathly afraid of it too, but kept it because it scared me. Then when I was 10, I just turned out my nightlight and was starting to snuggle under the covers when I felt someone tickling the blankets around me. I was really sleepy at first, so I thought it was my mom, but the second I realized she went to bed hours ago, I flipped on my back and 2 disembodied hands started choking me. My spirit left my body. This is possible, and I ran down to my parents' room screaming to help me. When I realized I wasn't there, I was back in my bed. I was not dreaming because I had marks on my neck, and I remember the time exactly when I turned out my light. Then when I was 13 in my house, I now stay in one night, I was meditating, and when I was down, I went to blow out my candles and I looked out the window. I saw a short man all in black with glowing red eyes. I couldn't move, and I was petrified until finally I ran to the bathroom. Soon afterwards, I could feel a presence in the room, and I had horrible nightmares. I packed all my stuff up and moved to the empty room next door. I went back later and blessed the room in the name of my goddess and haven't felt it since. When I was 16, me and my friend, her boyfriend, and my boyfriend all went to this graveyard one night because if you went through this clearing, you can jump on top of the crypts and hang out. It was the boyfriend's idea. They were talking amongst themselves, and me and Tiffany were quiet when I heard a little girl's voice directly underneath say "help me" in a whisper. It kept on for a while, every couple of minutes, and kept getting louder. I noticed that every time it happened, Tiffany was looking around, and I asked her if she heard it. She said, "Yeah, it says help me." The guys never heard it. A little time after that, I was riding in a truck with friends, and a big swirl of fire leaped across the road. It almost looked like a tumbleweed the way it swirled. I wasn't on drugs or anything. Neither of my friends saw it. Then sometime this year, currently 19, I was riding along with a friend when I looked out the window and I saw this thing running along the side of the road. I thought it was a large black dog, and I watched as it moved ahead of the car and then darted in front. I screamed "watch out," but it disappeared. My friend thought I was crazy. It wasn't just a shadow because I saw 4 legs moving, but if it was the ghost of a dog, it was a huge one. It was almost the size of a baby deer. Following this last encounter, I decided it was time to seek counsel from someone more familiar with the paranormal in an effort to make sense out of what was happening to myself and my family. I was fortunate enough to have become friends with a fellow service member whose wife had worked for a time at the Whaley House in Southern California. After relating to him some of the details of our ordeal, he assured me that she too had experienced encounters with the paranormal and would be most interested in hearing what I had to say. I made arrangements to meet with her at her earliest convenience. Cheryl was a very warm, gregarious woman and put me at ease immediately. She encouraged me to be open and honest about everything that I experienced, and convinced me that she would believe everything I had to say. She had always been sensitive herself, she said, was well versed in the use and interpretation of tarot cards, and had participated in a great number of successful seance and Ouija sessions. I began my tale. After I'd finished, Cheryl immediately suggested that she and my wife and I make arrangements to meet the following weekend for a Ouija session at our apartment. She advised me not to purchase a board when I told her we did not own one. She claimed that they were dangerous and that she would create a disposable one when she arrived. As I left her, I was both anxious and apprehensive awaiting the weekend. The following Saturday evening, Cheryl arrived as planned, and she immediately asked for a tablet of paper, a felt tip marker, and a roll of adhesive tape. She proceeded to create a Ouija board, fashioning it out of individual squares of paper and taping them to our kitchen tabletop. She then asked if we had a wine glass, which we gave her, and this she placed upside down in the middle of her unique creation. She instructed us to lightly place 2 fingers on each of the bottom of the inverted wine glass, and, shortly after we did as she instructed, she began asking questions to our spirit. The results were immediate and amazing. The wine glass became animated and moved so swiftly that we literally could not keep our fingers upon it. It initially traveled just inside the perimeter of the board in ever-increasing circles. As Cheryl asked questions, it would spell out the answers and then continued on its frenzied journey as before. Judging from the answers we received during the course of our questioning, we all surmised that our ghost was actually my guardian spirit and had been with me since birth. She was, according to the answers we received, responsible for every paranormal experience I and my mother had ever witnessed. Her name was Rachel, but she indicated that she preferred that everyone other than myself referred to her as Z. When my wife, during the course of our questioning, addressed Z by her given name, my guardian spirit became highly agitated as the wine glass suddenly shot out from beneath our fingers and struck my wife in the collarbone. Cheryl suggested that we immediately terminate the interview at that point. She proceeded to remove all of the paper squares used to create our makeshift board from the table and burned them in our kitchen sink. Following this, she took the wine glass we had been using as a planchet and poured a liquid into it that she had gotten from a container in her purse. She mumbled something, drank the liquid from the glass, washed it in the sink, and returned it to my wife. Cheryl then sat down with us and explained that in her estimation, Rachel evidently considered me to be her property, so to speak, and was extremely jealous of any female that challenged her authority in that regard. She stated that Rachel was very empathetic to my emotional state, and would tend to display more often while I was ill or at ease, or in a state of emotional distress or confusion. She suggested that my wife's and my recent reconciliation, following a brief separation, and my upcoming release from the service, were likely contributing factors to the frequency and intensity of our recent experiences with her. She was somewhat concerned, she said, about Rachel's blatant hostility towards my wife, but felt that as our lives returned to normal, Rachel would follow suit. She was right for the most part, until shortly after we moved. Following my release from the service, we returned back to the Midwest and lived for a brief period of time with my in-laws. During this time, my wife gave birth to our youngest son, and our experiences with Rachel became nothing more than unbidden recurring memory. By May of 1977, I was gainfully employed again, and by the following month, we were able to secure a townhouse which we leased for a year. Shortly after arrival in our new home, Rachel decided it was time to become reacquainted. She began innocently enough. Initially, the TV just began changing channels by itself again. Then we noticed that the water taps would shut off by themselves as we washed dishes, bathed, or showered. Usually it was the hot water that would be slowly extinguished, leaving us to wash in the icy cold water. Unless, that is, Rachel was upset with us for some reason. Then it was the cold water, scalding us until we realized what was happening and could defeat our efforts. The faucet knobs would be visibly turned to the right and be shut off. It took us a while to notice this, but we eventually did. We became accustomed to keeping an eye on the faucets so we could thwart her attacks. I should stress here that while I say we, and I did witness many of these occurrences, I was not subject to them personally. When I say we,
I mean my wife and extended family or friends that came to visit us. I should also note that Rachel never harmed or attempted to frighten the kids. I did, however, feel the effects of the furnace when it began turning on by itself during the summer months and the air conditioning turning on in the winter. It got to the point where my wife and I trained ourselves to subconsciously listen for almost the click of the thermostat control, so we could react quickly and accordingly. As odd as it sounds, these daily interruptions to our lives became almost commonplace and second nature until they were brought to our attention, sometimes hysterically, by our house guests, at which point we attempted, as rationally as we could considering the circumstances, to explain the phenomenon. We were for the most part able to assuage their fears. That is until my friend Dave spent the night. Dave was a lifelong friend of mine who called me unexpectedly one cold wintry night and explained that he had been physically evicted from his apartment by his wife, under threat of death should he attempt to remain, he claimed. He desperately needed a place to stay until she calmed down and became rational, so I, of course, invited him over immediately. He arrived at our townhouse shortly thereafter, carrying a sleeping bag and an overnight case containing what little he was able to stuff into it as his wife chased him around their apartment. He filled me in on all the juicy details of the latest arguments, and then, reluctantly, I was forced to bid him goodnight as it was getting late and I had to get up for work very early the following morning. He was settled in a sleeping bag on the living room couch, watching TV as I headed upstairs to bed. I didn't see Dave for a very long time after that. When I awoke the following morning and headed downstairs for my coffee and car keys, I immediately noticed that while Dave's sleeping bag, shirt, and shoes were still lying on the floor where he had left them the preceding night, he and his pants were nowhere to be found. Somewhat alarmed, I immediately went to the kitchen window, looked out into the parking lot, and noticed that his car was also gone. Had his wife called him at her house and begged him to come home, with a phone in our bedroom, we would have surely been awakened by its ringing, and Dave had assured me that his wife had no idea where he had gone. Had he called her perhaps? If so, why then hadn't he dressed before he left? Especially considering an extreme cold and with a foot of snow on the ground, there had to be a reasonable explanation, or so I hoped. Returning home from work that night, I immediately attempted to contact Dave by telephone at his apartment. The operator informed me that his line had been temporarily disconnected. I later learned that it had been ripped from the wall during he and his wife's argument. Growing more concerned, I then called his brother and was relieved to hear that he had indeed returned home to his wife the previous night. The circumstances regarding his sudden, half-nude departure from our house, however, was going to be left for Dave to explain, but Dave made no effort to contact me at all. 2 weeks to the day later, I was finally able to contact Dave by telephone at his apartment. He assured me that he and his wife were doing fine again and then oddly asked if I would personally return or mail to him the belongings left at our house that night. I suggested that he stop by for them one evening and fill me in on the details surrounding his sudden departure, but he emphatically refused. In fact, he stated that he would never set foot again in our house if he had anything at all to say or do about it. I was extremely perplexed at this point, and it took me 2 months and a 12-pack of beer to finally pry the story out of him, during which time I held his possession hostage. It seems that shortly after I had gone to bed that night, Dave decided that he should also get some sleep. He told me that he had gotten up from the couch and turned off the television and then slipped back into his sleeping bag. Almost immediately after he had settled in, facing the back of the couch, he said that someone tapped him on the shoulder. Assuming it was me, he turned over to face where he thought it would be standing and saw only the darkened living room. As my mother had years earlier, Dave said he came to the immediate conclusion that I was messing around with him and simply rolled over to go back to sleep. As soon as he did, he said, came the shoulder tapping once again. He claimed that he jumped up and turned on the lamp at the end of the couch, hoping to catch me as I ran to hide, and was surprised to find the living room once again empty. Somewhat unnerved, but again blaming me, he turned off the light, this time deciding to face the living room. The tapping now came from behind the couch. He ignored it. It came again. He again refused to acknowledge it. Suddenly, he said, one end of the couch, with him on it, was propelled approximately 3 feet into the air and dropped to the floor. He struggled out of the sleeping bag and bolted straight upstairs to where my family and I slept. He stood, he said, outside our bedroom doorway for almost 10 minutes, torn between awaking us or fleeing. After calming down, he decided to go to the bathroom and return to his sleeping bag, having rationalized that what he experienced could be attributed to that night's activities with his wife. He returned downstairs and headed for the half bath, located directly off of the kitchen. As he approached the bathroom doorway, he said that the bathroom light suddenly turned on by itself, and the door slammed shut directly in his face, missing him by only fractions of an inch. That was the final straw. He grabbed his pants from the floor near the end of the couch. He would have left them too, he said, had it not been for the fact that they held his car keys, and ran for the outside door. As he ran through the snow, struggling to get into his pants, he claimed that as he looked back towards the apartment windows, the bathroom curtains parted and the light went out. Dave held true to his word and never returned to our apartment again. I delivered his belongings to him personally as he requested. This is not a personal experience, but that of a friend. Her mother had been recently divorced and decided to buy a cute little house for herself and her 2 daughters to live in. The house was that of an elderly lady who was confined to a wheelchair. Before they moved in, the place needed a good cleaning, and some of the carpets needed changing, most notably the one upstairs, which had been the woman's bedroom and where she painted with oil paints, because there had been a worn path from the wheels on her wheelchair through the upstairs room where the lady had spent most of her time. The girls took the upstairs room, and their mother was downstairs. In the beginning, my girlfriend would hear noises during the night, but would think it was either the house settling or her imagination. Then she started to smell paint for no apparent reason, with or without the windows open, breeze or no breeze, night or day. The sounds became more defined and would often happen often. She told me that it sounded as though someone was moving around her room. She would hear the squeak of wheels, and the smell of paint was so strong. I never had the impression of fear from her. She often joked and said it was her room before it was mine, and she has every right to be here. In the 3 years that they lived in the house, before they moved out of state, the carpet in her room had to be changed 3 times because the same worn marks had been there when they first bought the house. It kept coming back. When I was little, my family just moved into a house in Des Moines, and the first night we stayed there, I had to sleep on the couch in the living room, with me being the oldest and all. Well, let's get on to the point. Here's what happened. I got up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. I came back, and the last thing I saw was my covers and my pillow. I started to shut my eyes, but then I opened them up for some reason, because I got a really strange feeling that I couldn't describe. And I saw a man right in front of me. He almost looked like an Amish guy, and he had these weird green eyes, and he just stared and glared at me. It felt so demonic. It felt almost evil. I couldn't even sleep. After that, I just froze. Then I put my head under my covers and screamed, "Mom, Dad." Just before my parents rushed in to see what was the matter, the Amish guy looked me dead in the eye, and he said one thing. He said, "If you ever tell anybody this happened, then you're going to die." The thing was, he was telepathically communicating with me. He didn't say it from his mouth, but he said it through his mind. I'm not sure if that makes sense or anything, but that's just what I felt. That was probably the most scariest ghost story I could ever tell to anybody, so I hope you enjoyed it.
I stumbled across your website about ghost hauntings and thought my current story could be handy. Firstly, I live in a little town and village at one of the most southern parts in Australia, along the SC coast. I'm 21 years old, never touched a single bad drug in my life except alcohol, and have no family with mental illness in my bloodline. About 4 months ago, I was reading my book in bed, and the lights were on. My dog was on the bed with me. Suddenly, at approximately 11 p.m., I heard a clap at the end of my bed, and the room went sorta cold. Suddenly, I heard a breathing hovering at the end of my bed, like something was watching me. I saw the dog growling at it. I checked outside to see if anything was out the window. Nothing could explain this demonic-sounding breathing that grew louder
and was getting slowly closer to me. As I was creeped out, I went onto my sister's room and was explaining what was happening when all of a sudden it was behind me, right next to my ear. It went into my sister's room, and this time it got extremely loud. She started crying and hiding under her boyfriend's arm. It stopped and went away. For the next week, I started to notice whenever I walked into different buildings, the power would fade in and out for a second. Everywhere I went. I put it down as coincidence until it just became too much of a coincidence. Also, at one point in this week, I swear I heard a demonic voice in the living room saying something I could not understand. I told it to leave. After a while, things stopped, and 2 months after the first incident, I was laying in bed one morning where suddenly I froze. I was trying to send a text message, and from what I recall, the writing changed. I was trying to read it, but my vision blurred, my body was shaking, and I could not speak. I definitely was not religious, but I was praying subconsciously. It was really intense. This lasted about 2 seconds, 2 months later, and it's up to today, on Monday. On Friday night, my mate stayed over. My dog was on my bed once again. I heard my dog growling at something, and based on past experiences, I decided to just roll the other way and sort of just block out everything. My mate, on the other hand, was scared to death, as he told me the next morning that a really bad presence was in the room. He said he just could feel it. It was suddenly cold, and he said breathing came from the hallway, got louder, and went into my bathroom, which is when the dog started to growl. It stuck around for about 2 minutes. My mate was too scared to move, and didn't even tell me it was happening. Last Sunday, possibly the most intense thing happened at around 4:30 a.m. I went to turn the DVD player off with the remote. I accidentally fell asleep with it on, and then rolled onto my left side. Out of nowhere, wind was rapidly blowing in the room. It was a harsh, freezing cold wind, blowing on my face as I was covered by my blanket. A very deep, dark, but clearer than usual voice echoed in my right ear. It was saying something in a totally foreign language I had never heard like before. I could not control my body at this time. I was frozen into my bed and could not speak. I was trying to recite a prayer that my mate's dad, who is a priest, told me to say if shit ever went down. I could only mumble it, and this time it snapped out, and I yelled the word God subconsciously. The room became so still. It was daunting. I like to consider myself to be very logical and usually skeptical. I never would have believed such stories in the past, but now that I've experienced it and have heard so many stories of my friends doing seances and stuff, I think it's legit. I do not believe this to be a human spirit. I actually believe it to be some form of bad spirit or a demon. I still am not a religious person. However, I now believe in the unseen. I hope to get some much needed sleep now. I've had slight hauntings all my life. Just little things that I'm sure mostly everyone has had happen to them. That is until my family moved into a home in De Pere, Wisconsin. The home is an area rich with history. It is supposedly where the last Dufresne was found. I've heard stories from other people whom lived in this area, and a lot of them have problems with their homes as well. Here is my story. We moved into the home when I was about 13 years old. At first, we loved the house and how big it was, but in the first few minutes of running through it, I could almost sense something was really odd about the house. It was just a spooky feeling that I had when entering some of the rooms. Our dog would freak out a lot and bark at imaginary things and would refuse to enter some rooms. Our friend would refuse to spend a night because they felt something evil in the home, and some claimed to see demons and shadow people. I came home to find my best friend sitting on my porch shaking and crying. She told me that she was in my bedroom and heard my mother's bedroom door slam shut. She went to investigate and found that there was no reason for the door to slam like it did. So, she opened the door and set a heavy clothes basket in between the door frame and the door itself. She left the area, only to hear the door slam shut 5 seconds later. She went back and found the clothes basket had been flung inside of the room. We also had an unusual fire that should have killed all of us, but for some reason, I woke up to discover its TVs would flip on and off by themselves also.
Alarm clocks would never stop the correct time either. I almost felt like the house had a good and evil battle going on with it, and we were caught in the crossfire. My sister and her friends would hear moaning noises a lot too. We finally told her mother that we needed to move, and she did not put up a fight. The day we moved out, she confessed to us that when she was sleeping, she would wake up to a feeling like someone was sitting on her and strangling her. She even felt the fingers once. When we got to our new house, the neighbors came over to greet us. They asked where we had just moved from. We gave them the address, and they got all very pale and told us that they too had lived in the same house and asked us if we had any problems living there. We compared stories, and almost everything was the same. The home is almost always for sale or rent. It just seems nobody wants to stay in it for very long. I did meet the current owner once, and he told me he has had no problems with the home, but I'm sure that he either is not noticing, or maybe the demons have finally left. It just seems like every home I lived in has the same little type of hauntings with it, or I'm just sensitive to that kind of energy, which I could live without. I have many things I could post here, but some I'm not ready to share yet. Hello, my name is Tiffany, and I have some uncertainties maybe you can clear up for me. When I was 6 years of age, my father was killed in a car accident on his way to work. To this day, I strongly feel his spirit remains with me. For the record, I love my father dearly, still do, and miss him so much. In the spring of 1992, as a class project for our psychology class, we had to take notes that night of the dream we had, if one was had, and share it with the class the next day. I still to this day cannot decipher if what I had was a dream or a near-death experience. I dreamt I sat in this tunnel. It had all my favorite childhood memories within it, my stuffed bear, my ball, my favorite tricycle, etc. Also in that tunnel was my father, dressed in a white gown, sitting on a chair. I knelt down next to him and listened to him tell me, "Tiffany, I love you, and I need you to understand this is not your time." I told him that I loved him and missed him so much, but he told me that I couldn't go, because then I couldn't tell my mom what he wanted me to share with her. He told me, "I understand you miss me, but you have to understand that one day we will all be together, and that time is not now. You have to let your mother know how much I miss her and care about her, as well as the rest of you. I have 6 siblings. The light in this tunnel was absolutely beautiful. I've never seen anything like it before. As I was drifting away from him in the dream, I was waking up, sobbing uncontrollably. Of course, I had to go and share this with my mom, and she was speechless. Since then, I've only had one other dream with my dad and siblings in it. Of course, real as ever, and again, so upset I couldn't be with them. I'm just not so sure if the first one was an actual dream, out-of-body experience, or near-death experience. It was just amazing. My second experience, when I was 20 to 21, I became pregnant. I lived with my cousin and her boyfriend in Ballsville, New York, in an apartment on Downer Street. One night, while I was close to my expecting date, I woke up to a woman without a face in a white gown, almost like a nun sitting at the end of my bed. When I sat up, she immediately disappeared. She showed up a few times after, almost as though she was watching over me. It didn't matter if I moved my bed from one side of the room to the other, she still found her way. To this current day, I still feel like I have family who have passed on watching over me. I've been told I have an older man, usually sitting at my kitchen table with a cigarette in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, which sounds much like my grandfather. I can't tell you how many times my fiance, 2 older sons, and myself have put our cell phones, digital camera, flashlights, anything with batteries on the kitchen counter, and within hours, the batteries are almost drained. We don't place these items up there as often as we used to. Many times when family is going to pass on, see the individual in a dream the night before, and that's when I know their time has come. I've had dreams which include the dead meant for other people, and let me tell you, they physically drain me. Oh my god, sometimes it's fun though. When relaying the message to the rightful person, and seeing their expression when I tell them something I have previous knowledge of and don't know what it means, but they have an understanding. It is just amazing. It seems to bring relief to them. I don't know if you can sort any of this out, or if any of this makes sense to you, but I know this stuff has happened to me, and it doesn't scare me. It seems like more of a wake-up call. Thank you for your time, and have a great evening. Thank you for listening as well. I sincerely appreciate it. My children and I had a very bad experience with a demon in a house that we lived in. My son became very scared one night as he viewed a ghost of a man with a sword sticking out of its side. This ghost was standing in the doorway of my son's bedroom very late one night. He said this thing was just giving him the feeling of such terrible dread and hatred. It made my son feel like it was going to kill us. My son started sleeping in my daughter's bedroom, and that thing started going from room to room, looking for my son, and so it started coming into our room and scaring the daylights out of me. I felt the hatred and anger. I know that it would have killed us if we had not gotten our pastor out there to help us. When our pastor pulled into our drive, he said he felt the anger and hatred just emanating from the house to the outside. He knew what we were up against, and we immediately started saying prayers to Jesus and his army of saints to fight for us. It ended up working so well that while we were living there, we had no more problems. But whenever we drive by, we cannot even look at the house. I know this was a short one, but I appreciate you listening. Hi, my name is Diane. Growing up in Detroit, my family lived in a house that was haunted. On several occasions, my whole family would hear loud crashes that could only be described as boxes of dishes being smashed. Everyone in my family experienced several ghost contacts in one form or another. On 3 different occasions with 3 different family members, a man about 60 was seen wearing a plaid flannel shirt. This man mainly stood there looking at the person, never attempted communication or harm. I was about 8 when he appeared, and I was the first one to see him, although my sister, who was 7 years older than me, was not present. I tell this to you now, so later you will understand. My relatives from out of town were visiting, and the adults were sitting in the living room after dinner. I was extremely quiet in the hopes that only a child can have, that they would forget that I was there. I was sitting on the couch and the front door was open, with the screen door closed. I saw the man wearing a red plaid shirt, staying at the front door looking in. I told my family, and they thought I was overtired and put me to bed. Later that same week, my older sister was getting into the shower when she saw a man in a red plaid shirt standing in the bathroom with her. She freaked out and told my mother, who this time listened more closely. She then revealed that she too had seen the man in the red shirt standing in the kitchen by the sink, looking like he was getting a glass of water. All family members routinely heard footsteps throughout the house, especially going up the stairs into an attic bedroom. The steps would continue across the floor. All my family members experienced this together and separate on several different occasions. My sister's, whose bedroom it was for a while, admitted she was scared to sleep in that room and was frightened very often, thinking that someone was coming into her room. I later had that same bedroom and became so afraid of it that I began sleeping on the living room sofa. On several occasions, dishes in the house would break when put in a certain china cabinet, and on 2 separate occasions, a silver meat platter in the china cabinet, whose doors were kept closed, flew across the room at my mother. Lights turned off in the basement would be on when we would wake up every morning. The dryer would routinely come on by itself, and even after the electric was checked out, this still continued. The basement had an old coal room that had been converted into a storage room with paint cans and stuff. This room had a negative feeling, and no one in the family liked to even go in there. Likewise, no one in the family wanted to go under the stairs, although no one had a mysterious occurrence in those places. Every family member in that house had heard their name called on different occasions many times when they were home alone. One occasion comes to mind. My father, who was home alone, was working in the basement. My mother, sister, and I were out shopping at the mall. He distinctly heard the front door open, even though it was locked, and someone walked across the living room and the kitchen. He walked upstairs and found the front door locked as he knew he would. It was then that someone called his name. He answered, and no one said anything after that. Another all-family experience came when we all went to visit my grandmother who lived across town. We even brought the family dog. We were returning home, and as we pulled into the driveway, I saw the drapes move back like someone was watching us return. I said, "Did you see that?" And my father countered, "What did you see?" I told him, and he and my mother and sister agreed that this is what they saw too. My dad went into the house first while we waited in the car. Everything was just as we left it with the doors locked. On one occasion, I woke to having a woman staying at the foot of my bed. She disappeared as soon as I got a good look at her. Her name was Anne. She said she had lived in that house. No one in the house ever saw Anne again. This house had an addition that was a former dining room off the back. It had built-in china cabinets that would fly open on no occasion, even after my mother put hooks on them, thinking the wood was swelling. Music was often heard playing softly. In all, it was a weird place to live, and we were all very glad to move. But we did live there over 20 years. My parents moved into an apartment, as I did in a different location, while staying with them because I had become extremely ill. I had a unique experience of a ghost nurse who took care of me. My parents were asleep, and I was lying on the sofa, so hot but lucid. I could hear them snoring from the bedroom. I heard soft whispers shuffle across the floor and felt a cold hand lovingly touch my forehead, checking my fever, a comfort. I was not afraid really, and somehow thought Grandma is here, but I had no evidence of this. I remember keeping my eyes closed, just knowing my nurse did not want me to see her. I was very conscious of my parents snoring and knew it was not them. When the feet shuffled off, I opened my eyes and got up and looked at my parents. They were sound asleep. The whole situation lasted maybe 2 minutes, yet I started to improve that night. Hi, I don't have any pictures or sound files, but I just wanted to share my story, and maybe you can give me an idea of what on earth I saw. When I was 6, I shared a room with my older brother. He was fast asleep, but I couldn't resist. I remember tossing and turning. I had this toy closet with a short door on it. I looked at the door and saw a large hole in it. It was black with no real shape and had a hole in the middle of it, the only spot that wasn't black. Anyway, I get up and shake the curtains, trying to see if it was a shadow. I put my hand in front of it. I move my toys and dolls. What is making the shadow, I thought. I stood in front of it and just stared, and then moved off the door and just hovered in front of me. Now, this is where it sounds really stupid, but remember, I was only a kid. I asked if it wanted to play chess. I was frightened, but didn't know what else to do. I turned and ran and looked, seeing it coming from behind me. I look up at my door. My room had no door, just an opening. And there was a black shadowy figure, like the smaller one, but in the shape of a very, very tall man. He was blocking my way out, but I didn't care. I ran through him and into my parents' room, under their covers, and never peeked out. Years later, when I was around 14, my best friend spent the night with me in that same room, and told me she woke up around 5 a.m. to see a tall, shadowy man looking down at us in the darkness. She thought it was my father. My father never comes up into my room. He never has. I know this is real. I wasn't dreaming or just imagining things. Have you ever heard a story similar to this before about a black figure that changed shape? I've never seen them since, but I'm still curious. After reading some of the experience others have shared, I wanted to highlight a few of my own. I tend to be very observant of activity around me, whether I see it or not. Some people think it's an overactive imagination, but if they felt and saw some of the things I have, they would think otherwise. I guess my first experience would have to begin with what I consider my guardian angel. To start off, I lived in a fairly average house with 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, which was built in 1960. There were no previous owners. My room was at the end of a long hallway with my parents right next to it, quite convenient for late night toilets. When I was around 6 years old, I had my first experience with a world other than my own. I remember it so clearly. I'd been asleep and had a disturbing dream. I woke up, about to call for my mother. At the time, my bed was on the opposite wall of the door, and I could see my parents' room and most of the hallway. Before I called out what I saw, what I thought was my mother came into the room. I had a distinct feeling of peace immediately. I saw her clearly wearing her bathrobe with the blue and white stripe down the center and rollers in her hair. She walked into the room and up the length of my bed. When she reached the head of the bed, I put out my hand to her and felt nothing but cool air. She just looked down, smiled, and vanished. It did not frighten me that she was gone, just the opposite. I felt relieved and immediately fell asleep. The next morning, when I awoke, I saw my mother in the living room and noticed that she did not have any rollers in her hair. I asked if she had worn anything the night before, and she said no. I then asked if she had come into my room that night, and again, the answer was no. I did not say anything further in case she would say I was just dreaming. I knew then, as I do now, that I was not dreaming. It wasn't until a few years later that I told her when another strange thing happened to me as I lay in bed. I was about 15 at the time and still having trouble sleeping. My room had since been rearranged differently, with the head of my bed moved to the diagonal corner from my door, still viewing my parents' room. As I lay waiting for sleep to take me, I had the strangest feeling overcome me. This has happened twice since. I was laying on my side, staring at the opposite wall, when my vision began to tunnel. I felt my body begin to go numb and could hear, distinctly, my heartbeat slow. At first I thought I was slowly falling asleep, until I realized that I was very much awake. I was still staring at the wall, and I could make out my hand laying in front of me. I tried to move but could not. I tried to call out and could not. I thought I was dying. I could still hear my heart slow and was watching as my eyesight dimmed. Just before all that went black, I heard a distinct voice, which I thought was my mother, call my name. I heard it several times before my body and mind were together again. As soon as I could move, I sat up to see if my mother was in the room. She was not. I then went into my parents' room, where both were sound asleep. I was extremely perplexed and exhausted after the ordeal. The next morning, I told my mother about the night before and about the time I was 6. She told me that it must have been my guardian angel, coming in a form that was soothing to me. I've now been to college twice and had other strange activity that did and did not include my angel. That can go for another time. And never forget that the young are always prone to see and hear what we cannot, because they are more open to the world than elders. It's not always an overactive imagination either. Thanks for reading. I've only had one paranormal experience. It happened last October when my boyfriend had temporarily rented a trailer. We had lived there for almost 2 months and nothing out of the ordinary had happened. One afternoon, he decided to take a nap and I was in the living room watching TV. I started hearing this really strange continuous screeching noise. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall beside his bedroom door. When I walked over there, it stopped. I sat back down and started watching TV again, and it started back again. This time, I walked into the kitchen. The bedroom was right beside the kitchen, and I started opening the bottom cabinets, and once again, the screeching stopped. I never said anything about it to my boyfriend because I didn't think a lot about it at the time. A couple of days later, we were in the kitchen eating breakfast, and he told me that the day before, when he was there by himself, that he heard a weird, loud screeching noise. He said he tried to find it where it was coming from, and it would not stop when he'd look. I told him that the same thing had happened to me while he was asleep a few days earlier. We both talked about ghosts and laughed about it, pretty much dismissing it as a joke. A few minutes later, his mom came and stayed all night and was asleep on the living room couch. This particular night, we were sleeping in the bedroom on the opposite end of the trailer. It was really late, probably around 3 a.m., and we had been laying there talking when I started hearing this noise. It was kind of like the screeching, but much quieter, and screeched at intervals, like footsteps. I thought my boyfriend had his hand dropped over the side of the bed, making that noise with his hand against the plastic on the mattress. I said, "Brian, quit making that noise." He said, "I'm not making that noise," and held up both of his hands. He looked at me as scared as I looked back at him and said, "Get up and get dressed." As soon as he said that, you could actually tell where the screeching was moving through the room to the corner beside the bed and feel this undescribable presence, and all of a sudden, the screeching just went crazy and so loud. It was right there. Needless to say, within a split second, it was the only one there. Now, can you imagine 2 grown adults running into the living room to wake up his mom? She said she hadn't heard anything, but that we scared her to death running through the living room at 3 a.m. in the morning like we were on fire. We sat up in the living room for the rest of the night and moved back to his mom's house within the week. So far, that's the only experience that I've had. I'm the only one in my family who believes in ghosts. I have plenty of reasons too. Many of these experiences I've never spoken of to anybody until now. My friends and family wouldn't believe me if I began to tell them, because I have so many different experiences with what I believe are ghosts. I think I'm meant to know of them. I feel like I have a connection with the dead. All of this probably sounds pretty unbelievable, especially coming from someone as young as I am, but it all happened. When I was very young, like maybe 3, I remember being watched. I remember shadows by the closet door. I think it was the shadow of a man. He watched me every night. Usually, he would just stand there. Once or twice, he would move towards me, and I ran into my parents' room, where they would let me stay. The shadow followed me into that room too, but I felt safe with my parents. For the next couple of years, I don't remember much. When I was 5, I lived on a farm in Nebraska. It was a really quiet area. I remember seeing a young woman, late teens, early 20s, running through the woods, laughing and giggling. If any of my experiences were to be blamed on my imagination, it would be this one. Though it was only my imagination, I don't understand how it appeared in my memory with such vivid detail. Later that year, I moved back to my home state, Virginia. Virginia is a pretty amazing state. It is one of the first places people came to when they discovered America, and it is also full of historical sites from both the Revolutionary War and Civil War. Many battlefields and cemeteries. Anyway, when I first moved back there, my mother, my brother, and I were staying with my grandparents. It's a pretty old brick house. Before my grandparents moved into it, it was owned by my great aunt Clara. Ever since the first time I stepped into my grandma and grandpa's bedroom, I always get the chills. Even now, I dread going in there alone. When I was younger, the eyes of the picture of Aunt Clara would follow me. They would follow me across the room. My brother has always been just as scared of the room as I have. He would never tell anybody why. To this day, he refuses to go into the room. I remember the scariest was when I was 5. I was napping on Grandma's bed, and I was dreaming about Great Aunt Clara. All I remember about the dream was that she was wearing all black, and she was reaching out to me. I woke up sweating. The room was so dark, but I made out her figure standing at the front of the bed, reaching out to me like in a dream. I got up and ran out of the room and into the dining room, where I was pushed headfirst into the leg of the large solid dining room table. I turned to see who had pushed me, and nobody was there. I had to go to the emergency room for stitches in my forehead. I never told anybody about seeing her because nobody would have believed me. Shortly after, we moved. I've submitted a story on the site before, but since then, I've had another experience, so here it goes. I'm in my late teens, and during the summer, I stay home alone. One day around 11 a.m., I use the computer, and out in the hallway out of the corner of my eye, I saw a completely black figure, about 6 foot 5 inches tall, and very skinny.
When I glimpsed around to make sure no one was in the house, the figure was gone. It happened to me about 4 more times over the next 2 weeks. I started calling them the Shadow Man. Then one day, when I was in the kitchen, I saw another Shadow Man. But this time, when I looked around my shoulder, a can of soup fell onto the floor, and the window was closed, and the cat was in the basement. Another moment, I was with my friends in the woods. Keep in mind, these are small woods, and there are never any hunters or trappers there. We were talking about ghost stories, and I told them about the Shadow Man. A minute later, we heard a rustling in the bushes, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a Shadow Man. Then when I turned to catch a glimpse of it, it was gone. I asked my friends if they saw that, and one of them said yes, and the rest looked at me like I was crazy. I'm not sure if these are spirits or just an overactive imagination, but I usually don't imagine things like that. Since the experience in the woods, I haven't seen a Shadow Man since, but you never know. I could see one again sometime. Thanks for listening. My name is Kara, and I have another story I would like to share. This encounter, or whatever it's called, took place in the kitchen. It was about midnight, or 1 in the morning. My mother was asleep. I was on the computer, playing brain teasers or something, and my dog, Susie, a collie, was lying next to me in my chair. As I was playing my game, Susie started to make a noise, in between a bark and a growl. I looked to see what she was staring at, and she was looking into the kitchen. Our house is little, but it's cozy. I couldn't see anything, so I took it as attention-seeking and hushed her. About 10 minutes later, Susie was sitting in the corner directly across from where I sat, and she made a deep growling noise that was so unnatural to me, and she bared her teeth. Not at me, but towards the kitchen. I didn't want to look for her, I admit fear. I thought I would see someone like a burglar of some sort. I looked out of the corner of my eye, and that's when I saw a very, very large white dog. Looked like a wolf dog to me, because it was so large. It had eyes as blue as the sky, and fur as white as snow. It didn't look threatening, but intimidating. It just laid there by the recycling bin, and stared at me. Susie whimpered and caught my attention. I looked at the corner of my eye, and the dog was gone. That night, everything was so still, quiet, freaky, the way nothing seemed to be able to move, like a pause button had been invented to freeze the noise after the dog had vanished. I went to my room to lay down, but my room was piled with clothes, books, etc., so I decided to go to my mother's room to sleep, since her bed was a king size and clean. The time passed by as I laid there. 1:30, 2:30, 3:30 a.m., all the way to 4:30 a.m. I just stared at the wall with a background of my mother's snores. I glanced at my mom's door for a second, and there, perched on the door, was a dark cat figure. It had evil green eyes, fur as though it had caught the dark glistening of nighttime. I stared at it for no more than 10 minutes. I rubbed my eyes. It was gone. It seemed as though someone played the sound button again, like the mute button wouldn't work. I looked out the window on my left, and I saw a cat crossing the street, and I decided to doze off. But something didn't seem right. It was like the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the room. I didn't like it, and neither did Susie. She sleeps at the foot of Mother's bed. She gave a very low growl and came over to lay next to me. I pet her for a minute and glanced at the hallway and saw what appeared to be an overgrown house cat. I fell asleep 10 minutes after that. I still don't know the connection between the dark cat figures and the white dog, but if you happen to know, I'd like to hear from you. I've been reading through everyone's stories, and I decided that maybe I should go ahead and share one of my own. I'm 30 years old now. This happened when I was 4 years old. My parents and I were traveling to Oklahoma City to visit my mom's sister. Mind you, this is a short story, but definitely very eerie. Anyway, on the night before we arrived at my mom's home, we stayed the night at a hotel. My mother is not one to be inconvenienced. She needs her own space. So instead of staying in my aunt's house, she put in a stay at a cheap motel. My father obliged her. Now mind you, I did not know about what happened that night until I was about 15, because my mother was so freaked out about what happened that night that she did not tell me about it until then. Only then did it come out in conversation. She said that sometime during the night, while her and my father were asleep on one bed, and I was asleep on the other, at about 3 or 4 in the a.m., I sat straight up and proceeded to scream. She said that my father tried to console me, but I would not stop, and the worst thing about it was that I did not sound like a small girl. She said I sounded like a grown woman in agony. After a second or two of my father trying to speak to me to calm me down, nothing seemed to work, so he had no choice but to shake me violently. They said that I looked at them and laid back down like nothing even happened. Mom said her and her dad stayed up the rest of the night, and all was well. However, when we arrived at my aunt's house during dinner, my mother brought up the subject, and she explained to my aunt in detail what had happened. My mom said my aunt froze and looked across at my uncle. That was when she proceeded to tell me about the trench coat man. My mom asked, "Who was the trench coat man?" She said last night, while she was sleeping, and while that incident was occurring with her daughter, she was awakened by a trench coat man. A dark figure in a trench coat, of course. He was just staring at her. My aunt then described the eyes that she saw. This man had crystals in his eyes, as if his eyes were so cold, like he didn't care about anybody. So this dark trench coat man, blurred figure with glowing glacial eyes, kept staring at her until he eventually disappeared 5 seconds after. That was when my aunt screamed, and my uncle woke up, asking what was the matter. Of course, that was when my aunt went on to explain seeing the presence of this man. After thinking long and hard about the incident, I'm able to conclude that this was a paranormal incident that occurred telepathically. I must have detected that something was wrong with my aunt, and I guess I was trying to scream to let someone know that something was wrong at the moment, even though I was not conscious and I had no idea what was going on at the moment. The real question I really like to know is, who was that trench coat man? What was he doing talking to my aunt? Or what did he want from her? I know a lot of people are going to say this is a load of bull, and believe me, I really wish it was too. But the fact of the matter is, it actually happened. Ghosts are real, and you don't want to come face to face with them. This is just a collection of experiences I've had, and I don't know if they go together or make any sense at all. First was when I was about 8, and me and some of my friends were out in the backyard telling ghost stories. All of a sudden, we heard a deep voice slowly calling our names. It seemed to come from behind a shed in the backyard, and we all ran away from it. We ran into the house, and then calmed down, thinking it must have been my father. But then I realized my father was at work, and all of our neighbors were pretty up there in age, and I doubted they even knew our names. We were calming down in my room when I looked out the window, and about 200 feet away in an empty field, I saw the outline of what seemed to be a man, but was totally black. But it was in the middle of the day. I couldn't even speak. I finally yelled as it was walking away, and I think when I yelled, it turned and looked back at me. I never saw it again, and even writing about this is bringing tears to my eyes. The other experiences I had were in the same room, in my grandma's house. When I was young, I used to sometimes go to my grandmother's and stay for a weekend or a night. One night, I was sleeping, and I got up half asleep, in some sort of confusion of hearing something in the hallway. I looked down the hall, and there seemed to be a shadow of a tall man against the curtains, with moonlight shining through them. I wasn't scared like the first time, but I actually felt like this man was watching over me, and for some reason, I had a weird feeling it was my great-grandfather. The other time, when I was about 16, I was actually living in that room because I had moved out of my parents' house temporarily. It was a typical night. I laid down to go to sleep, but was having some trouble. I finally started to get drowsy, and I rolled over onto my other side, and then out of nowhere, I hear my name whispered urgently into my ear. I even felt the air. I jumped up, and no one was there. I had the door closed, but my grandpa was somewhat of a jokester, so I thought maybe he was pulling a prank. So I got up and looked down the hall, and I saw him and my grandma in bed, watching TV. He may be a prankster, but I doubt he can run that fast. I'm 18 now, and I haven't seen or heard anything weird since, but I also don't spend very much time at my grandma's house anymore. Thanks for reading. I've been pondering where to begin and which experiences to prioritize. I decided to begin at the beginning and submit separate accounts of my experiences chronologically. In other words, I've got many stories to share. I've read nearly half of the stories on this site, which is a really worthwhile form, and I hadn't realized that much of what I've brushed off, for whatever reason, is something that matters to others enough to write about it. My experiences are not earth-shattering compared to what many have endured, but I think they're worthy of reading about. When I was about 7 years old, my mother became involved with her friend's Jehovah's Witness study group. Now that I look back on it, I might want to mention that this was in the mid-70s, and my parents and those friends, a couple, were classic long-haired hippies, and they did their share of the stoner scene. My mother and Grace, her friend, were in a study group with Grace's mother-in-law, and all older white-haired, straight-laced women. They eventually ended up at our house to study, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Theory is this: my mother, who was raised strictly Catholic, was going to become a nun, only to do as her grandmother, Granny, wished. They were very close, and my mother wanted to make Granny proud. That all went out the window when she met my father. She thinks that the opposing forces seemed very interested in having her on their side, kind of like vying for her soul. I know it sounds far out, but I kind of believe it, from witnessing and experiencing the darker aspects of it as a result. She also had many things happen to her all of her life that make my story seem lame. It is prevalent on the maternal side of my family to have had experiences with the otherworldly beings. Anyway, shortly after my mother started fraternalizing with the study group, something sickening started to happen in our house. We had the fold-up, pull-down type of chairs to the attic and our living room ceiling. There was a door at the top of them, but it wasn't at the head of the stairs, as this area was open. Instead, for some reason, it was opposite. If one were to walk around to the back of the attic, open this door, and proceed through it, they'd fall into the living room through the opening in the ceiling. Well, this door started to be slammed with a force that shook the entire house. It scared the living hell out of us. It was really that horribly violent. My parents pulled down the stairs, and this door was ajar. They shut it. It kept happening often. They somehow tied the door shut by the knob. It still happened, but worse. The windows literally shook. Pull the stairs down. It was still tied shut. One day, during the late summer, the group was over at our house, doing whatever prayer stuff they do. My father was at work, and my older brother, Grace's kids, and I were playing outside. We heard screaming coming from inside the house. We ran inside to hear the attic door slamming, beyond what any door should sound like, and this horrid, guttural growling noise coming from up there. It just sounded that awful, that no one can convince me that whatever it happened to be was ever human. Everyone ran screaming out of the house, to their cars, and they were telling my mother to get us too, and get out of that house. Well, we left for a little while, but my mother decided we couldn't be homeless, so we went home. Not my idea of a good time. It continued to happen, usually lasting 5 or so minutes. It happened at least once a night. Well, my mother had an experience shortly after we had gone back to school. She claims that when she was home alone in the living room, with the windows open, the air just went silent. No birds chirping, no chipmunks, no locusts buzzing, nothing. We all lived in the country, away from any other houses. She said she started hearing the sound like a vacuum cleaner. It got louder and louder, and seemed to pulsate. It filled the room, and the walls looked as if they were buckling and waving. She smelled this horrid, rotting stench, and she kinda knew she was in for something pretty awful. She ran into her room. I'd have run the hell out of the house, and jumped into her bed. She pulled the covers over her head. She said she heard something walking slowly across the living room, towards her doorway, which was open. She was just praying, not daring to look. It sounded to her as if it were dragging a heavy cloak behind it, and it was breathing extremely heavy. It was nearly at her bed, and she was just about dying of fear when apparently our school bus pulled up, and it dissipated. She'd apparently had enough. She took any religious materials she had brought into the house from the group, not including her Bible that she had gotten from Granny, which she kept, and burned it in the fire pit out back. I remember being upset when she took both my brothers and my books, which I guess you could say was like kids' versions of Bibles. They were small, pink, hardcover books, and they had pictures, and were easy to understand for me at that reading level. I absolutely loved to read, and it didn't matter what it was. I cried, but they got burned anyway. Well, I got over it soon, as nothing more of that nature ever happened at that house. It left as quickly as it came. It was evil. I strongly believed demonic, and it seemed like it was satisfied that my mother quit the group and burned the literature associated with it. It was not associated with the house. It came with a purpose, and left having achieved its goal. The only other thing I associate with this battle of good and evil of my mother happened when I was in 7th grade. I was trying to sleep, totally different house, but I swore my bed was shaking. I just figured I was being stupid, but it got worse. Still, I tried to dismiss it. It got bad enough to where I became scared crapless. I got up and went out to the living room. I startled my mother. She asked me what was wrong. I told her, and she got these big, weird-looking eyes, like she said she was spooked. She said, "Oh my God, I was just reading the Bible." She rarely opened it, for fear of bringing something on. Well, I was just fine with her not reading it. If it was going to target me to get to her, I just wanted to be left out of the whole thing. I know that probably sounds ignorant, but I truly felt it was demonic, and it scared me out of my mind. After what happened, I felt anything bad might just pop up at any time. Even though I'm not close to my mother, haven't spoken to my family in about 14 years, my heart does go out to her on whatever her spiritual fate is to be. She's not the best person, but she isn't inherently evil, just a broken, miserable woman from years of abuse by both her father and my father. This experience added to my straying from any traditional religion. All I knew of Christianity was what my mother told us as kids, and some of what I read in my pink Bible-like Bible book, and it wasn't much. I'd always had my own thoughts about the whole heaven and hell concept, but I was afraid of burning in this hell if I strayed from it. It just didn't sit right with me. It always scared me, including the concept of God. My concept of him was that he was very quick to punish anyone who had their own free thoughts and let people roast at the drop of a hat. I always felt spirituality shouldn't be a frightening experience, but I didn't have the hair on my butt when I was young to explore my inner beliefs. I was never baptized, and I suppose I'm pagan, if anything. It's confusing, but as much as I don't adhere to the whole Bible concept, I can't dismiss it for others. To end this story, I just want to thank you for taking the time to glimpse into my reality. I also have to acknowledge that some of you may have thought that much of it was due to my parents' use of weed, but myself and all of the others didn't imagine something so wretched. Rest assured, ladies of the study group wouldn't have been altered. The very last noteworthy thing of my mentioning, in accordance to the subject, is that I did later independently, and most unwillingly, encounter another demon-like thing when I was 19. Yes, quite another story. Please tune in. I've experienced quite a bit throughout my life when it comes to the paranormal, and it all started at my old childhood house. It was a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom home in Garden Grove, California. If you were to drive by and look at this house, it's cute, and it's a little home in a good environment. However, the things I've experienced sparked my interest and curiosity about the afterlife. Everything in every room in the house felt awkward whenever I walked into it. I shared the middle bedroom with my younger brother, who was only 4 at the time. Once a month, I would have a nightmare of a girl sitting on her picket fence with red eyes aglow, staring at me with such a playful expression. She didn't seem happy that her family was there. Nonetheless, us kids. The strange part about that was, whenever I would have these awful dreams, I would wake up to find my little brother crying, as if someone had really hurt him. I never really took the nightmare seriously though. We had an old, rusty swing set that we loved so much. I was only 10 at the time. During the daytime, everything would be fine, and no strange feelings would occur. However, once nighttime falls, our backyard would be off limits. My mom wouldn't let us go to the back and play on summer nights, and she, well, never told us why. One night, my mom forgot to turn off the water hose, so she kindly asked me if I would do it for her. The idea of it was already bothering me, but I didn't take anything paranormal into consideration. So, I went down, straight to the back of the house, and the walk there felt like eternity itself. I had a strong, eerie feeling that I was being watched, and even followed. I bent down to turn off the hose, and had a fear so strong that it made me tear up. I ran into the house, and swore never to do the favor for my mother again. What made this incident particularly eerie was the fact that I swear I heard a sobbing. It was like in my mind, but I swear it was outside. In another awkward time, my mom was taking a shower, and I was in my room watching TV with my little brother. I heard her call my name, so I came to see what she wanted.
She asked if I could go to the towel cabinet and grab her one. When I did, I walked up to the door in pure darkness, and I swear I saw a ghostly hand, but it was still a woman's hand with red fingernails. I immediately thought it was my mom's hand at first. The strange thing was, it was translucent. Like I said, a ghostly hand. But I mean, you could see right through this person's hand. So, naive as I was, I thought I said Mom, and instinctively handed her the towel. The towel dropped to the ground, and the hand disappeared. My mom then opened the door and looked at me, saying, "Barbara, what are you doing, honey?" That's when I told her, "I was giving you the towel you wanted." My mom looked at me with such confusion and said, "You know I was in the kitchen, right?" When I look back at that instance, I know it terrifies me now, but at that moment, I was simply not afraid. I just chalked it up to something non-paranormal, and maybe my eyes were just playing tricks on me. But at that moment, it was pretty obvious that I was both hearing and seeing things come to life. Paranormal things at that. There was much more that went on in that house, such as if you were sitting in the living room watching TV, at the corner of your eye, you will see a dark figure walking up to the front door. Immediately, you would assume someone was here, so you trot over to the door to find that no one is there. It happens almost every week to everyone in my family. I love that house, but I didn't love being followed or the feeling of being watched while taking a bath. After spending most of my childhood in that house, we moved to another city nearby. Now this house is quite dramatic. I'm 19 years old now, and I lived in Georgia for 3 years to finish up school. Coming back, strange activities started happening, especially in my new room. My grandfather passed away 3 years ago, and my room used to be his room. At night, getting home from my boyfriend's house, I would hear the floor creaking. I just assumed there was someone walking around, but to find that no one was out there at all. I remember one night, laying on my bed with the lights out and just the TV glaring. I fell asleep and woke up to see a pair of transparent, veiny legs pointing in my direction. I knew immediately who they belonged to. Grandpa. Grandpa was watching over me, and that didn't and still doesn't scare me. But there's another presence in the house. A girl, I assume. I came one night from staying at my boyfriend's the previous night. I left the door opened because I was planning on changing and going to say hi to my parents. While changing, I have a habit of looking at the door to see if anyone will walk by and see me change. So, I looked a few times, and when I looked the last time, at the right side of my door, I swear I saw the apparition of a girl, her bright blue eyes, glowing and bulging right at me through the crack of the door. The eyes then disappeared. I trotted to the door, looked to my right, and nobody was there. Just then, it was my teenage cousin, Diane, but I looked towards the left side of the hallway, and there she was. I was absolutely freaked out in that moment. Well, those were some documented instances of my family's paranormal history. I hope for future sake that I never have to experience any of this again, even though the first few incidences weren't that scary, and even my grandpa incident, yeah, I wasn't scared. However, if it were any kind of other ghost, like the one I was just talking about, I might be a little bit more frightened. I'd like to refer to this haunting as the haunting in Duxbury, Vermont. We bought the house from the niece of Leo Morse in the fall of 1999. Leo lived here his entire life.
Shortly after we moved in, we heard strange footsteps on the second floor when we knew no one was up there. During one such incident, my husband, myself, my 2 children, and a couple friends heard someone walking across the floor in the upstairs bedroom as we all stood in the living room below. One night, when I was taking a bath and was lying back in the tub with my eyes closed, I suddenly felt very uneasy, like someone was staring at me. I looked behind me to where the door was and saw this transparent mist, and it disappeared within a second. The door creaked open just an inch, and I screamed my head off. My son, while still in high school, had similar experiences of being watched by someone who couldn't be seen. Our television has also turned on by itself on more than one occasion. Our channels have changed, with the remote sitting out of everyone's reach. In the fall of 2007, my husband had just walked upstairs to go to our bedroom when I heard him hollering at someone and asking him what he wanted. We all ran upstairs to where my husband stood in the doorway to our bedroom. He was staring at the back wall of the other bedroom, pointing to no one and yelling, tears in his eyes, for someone who no one else could see to get out. This lasted for several minutes until the man, whom my husband said was in his early 30s, brown hair, clean shaven with round, wire frame glasses, dressed in a flannel shirt and blue jeans with the bottoms of the legs rolled into cuffs, disappeared. It was a very restless night that night, and my husband, who is not drunk or on drugs and isn't prone to hallucinations, doesn't like to talk about it much, but is very adamant that it truly happened. We haven't had any more sightings since then, but I still hear footsteps and unexplainable bangs and thumps coming from upstairs every morning after I get up, and I know my husband is still sound asleep in our room. My name is Andrea. I'm from New Mexico, and I'm 17. I've had numerous experiences throughout my life with the paranormal. I'll start from the beginning, I suppose. Before moving to Deming back in 2000, I lived in Hatch, which is about an hour away. We used to live in what was called the White Brick House, near the park, and not even a half mile from the schools. Hatch is very small. Anyway, living in the house was my mom, my very abusive dad, who I call Alex. I don't even call him dad. My 2-year-old sisters, and my older brother, and me, the youngest. I don't remember the experiences in any specific order, but I remember them as if they happened yesterday. They are all very true. Believe if you want. We had a certain room called the back bedroom that no one really liked to go to, at least not alone. This room had an extremely strong presence in it, and it was only when you entered it you could feel its presence. You could stand in the doorway and look in the bedroom and feel nothing, but as soon as you stepped, that all changed. You feel like you're being watched by one great evil spirit, or a great number of evil spirits. You would have to leave. It was so uncomfortable. We couldn't even get any of the dogs that we had throughout the time we lived there to enter that room. While there was that room, there was also other things that happened in the rest of the house. One night, my mom swears up and down this happened, and so does Alex. They were getting along. The rare occasion. I love these nights. My mom put all 4 of us to bed, so her and Alex had some alone time, and were relaxing together in the spa, talking one night. In the middle of their conversation, both my mom and Alex saw the shadow of someone walk past the doorway of the spa room. My mom thought it was one of us that had gotten up in the night and went to check in on us, only to find us all snoring in bed. Her and Alex then asked us the next morning if we had gotten up, and none of us had. Another time, Me and my oldest sister were playing in what we called the second kitchen that had a room off called the craft room. My mom paints ornaments in there. We suddenly smelled a strong perfume that didn't smell like any perfume made today. Then we heard a conversation between maybe 4 or 5 people. We looked in and saw 5 older upper-class people in clothes from the early 1900s time. I remember one man specifically. He was bald, with a brown beard, and a looking-glass eyepiece like the rich people would wear back in the day. He was wearing a black penguin-tailed suit with a white button-up underneath. He looked somewhat pale, but not very transparent. He turned his head slowly and looked straight at me, not my sister, and nodded his head. Shortly after, he continued to speak with his company. I ran to my room and stayed there for the rest of the day. We had an organ in the living room, along with a drum set and Alex's guitars. We're all musicians. Amps would turn on, even when they were unplugged. The organ played as though a very experienced pianist were playing it. Piano was one thing none of us really learned how to play, so it was obvious none of us was playing it. There were times when the dogs would follow something we couldn't see down the hallway to my room and Alex's room. My older brothers one night got up to get a drink of water in the second kitchen, and that's where the laundry room also was. He's 22 years old now, and still swears this is true. He saw a tall figure standing by the washer and dryer near the back bedroom, and he felt it as an evil being. It just stood there, glaring at him, but never moved, as if it was frozen, but with the evil expression looking at him wherever he moved. He figured it was Alex. He shouted out Alex's name, but didn't hear a response, so he figured he was mad and went back to bed. The next morning he asked Alex why he was so mad at him. Alex just looked at him and said he was at the bar. My other sister said she was walking by the back bedroom one night and swears she saw a black figure out of the corner of her eye standing straight up against the wall, and it tried to grab her with its arms but couldn't reach, as if it was restrained. After Alex left, we moved out of the house and into a little apartment. There's only been one thing that has ever happened to me there. I got up in the middle of the night to get something to drink, and as I was going back to my room, I saw what looked like a little blue orb glowing in intense blue. It moved around for a few minutes before ultimately dissipating into thin air. Aside from these apartments we lived in, we also moved into a trailer not too far from the white brick house. This house was always said to be haunted because the man who used to live there died of a heart attack in either the yard or the bathtub, and he had 2 dogs that died of mysterious causes after he did. It was almost as if they died of a broken heart. There would be nights when we could hear the clicking sounds of a dog's nail on the tiles. I was in my room reading one night when my whole dresser just fell over. No reason for it just to fall over. My friend and I, Rosario, and my sister were all in the living room one night when we heard a window shatter come from my room. We never found a single shard of broken glass in the house or even outside, even though the sound came from inside. Finally, I would always see the shadow of someone walk into the laundry room, and no one would be there when I looked. All of these incidents were fairly alarming to all of us, and I'm convinced that they were being followed by the same evil spirit that resided in the red brick house. These days, I never experienced any hauntings, and I'm very glad that this is all over. In the fall of 2001, my parents bought an old Victorian house in a quiet suburb. It was a huge relief for us because that year was a very tumultuous time for our family. We couldn't find a house that was affordable, and nearly every house we found in the area was either in need of major repairs are super expensive. When we moved into this home, there had been mumblings around town that nobody wanted it due to its supposed hauntings. By the way, I'm 21. The house had a history of violence and death. The city is very safe now, but years ago, it was considered one of the worst cities to live in. It was said that a man who had lived his entire life as a loner took up residence in the house in the early 1920s. One night, he apparently hired a prostitute to stay the night with him. She was unaware that he had no money to pay her for her services. He led her into the kitchen, playing off that he had some spare cash lying around the house. He ultimately ended up strangling her to death and chopping up her body. He was apprehended months later and ended up dying in prison. When the cops questioned him, all he could say was that he needed love. In the first months, we had stereotypical noises that any house would make and dismissed it as nothing more than just noises. However, doors would open and close, lights would flicker on and off, and there was this funky odor that always seemed to linger throughout the house. It was very hard to describe, but it smelled a lot like rotten eggs on a very subtle level. The most terrifying thing that occurred was when I was in the kitchen in the middle of the night. It was about 11 p.m., and I had just come home from work and entered the front hallway of the house at first. That's when I heard whispers, which sounded like the word lonely. I figured I was just exhausted from a long day's labor, so I decided I needed to get to bed. But before I did, I fixed myself something to eat in the kitchen. I walked into the kitchen, but that's when I heard moaning sounds, almost like someone was struggling. As I sat on the chair by the kitchen table, I saw the transparent figure of a woman with an anguished look on her face. She appeared for a few moments, then disappeared. She looked like she was from another era and wore all black. Her face looked disfigured and beaten. It terrified the living hell out of me, so I ran upstairs to get my parents. I guess I just needed some comforting, and I found out they weren't home yet. There were other incidents that occurred in the house. My mom actually told me that she was in the laundry room when she could distinctly hear the sounds of a growling man in the laundry room late at night. This was something that seemed to happen quite frequently around the same time, and always only in the laundry room, nowhere else. It was never something really loud and startling. It was always faint, but insanely scary. There were times that we would see two shadows in the corner of our eyes constantly walk back and forth from the kitchen to the living room. Again, this was subtle. When anybody would actually turn to directly look, these shadows would be gone. Most of the time, we always thought it was just our eyes playing tricks on us, and even after my incident, I still thought that. Anyway, that's my story. It might not be too exciting compared to others, but it is creepy and insane. I'm glad I don't live in that house anymore. Sadly, my parents still do, but it seemed that nothing happens anymore, besides the subtle doors creaking open slowly from time to time, and the continuation of lights flickering. Thanks for reading. My family and I took a trip to Tennessee in the summer of '08. We went all over the place, such as Jackson and Nashville. On our second to last day before we left to go home, my family decided to go to Franklin because we had picked up a brochure of haunted places in Tennessee, and so we went to humor me because I was interested in hauntings at the time. This city, not known to most people, is actually the site of the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, even worse than Gettysburg. There are two houses that were the main sites. One of them was the Carnton Plantation, which is the setting to my story. The plantation was creepy enough when we drove up to it, without even knowing the history. When I got out of the car, I looked up at the house and noted how beautiful it was. Then my attention was averted to the balcony on the second floor. There, standing on it, was a man. He was clearly dressed in a Civil War uniform, though I quite can't remember which color, and I could clearly see that he had a beard covering his jawline. He stood there with his arms behind him, as if he was gazing out, overlooking troops. Of course, at the time, not knowing any of the history, I thought it was just a tour guide taking a break out on the balcony. I even hoped he was going to be my family's guide. Later, once we were on the tour, I noticed that none of the employees were dressed like 19th century citizens. Of course, then we got the history of the place, and I understood why this place was considered haunted. When the battle itself was both going on, and when it was over, injured soldiers were treated inside of the house. So many, in fact, that there are stains of blood inside of the house that will not come out of the floor. Many soldiers obviously died inside of the house. When we continued our tour upstairs, we entered a room with a door to the balcony. This is where I learned that no one was allowed out on the balcony. This confused me since I'd seen that man out there. When the guide took the group into the room across the hall and began talking, I couldn't pay attention. The closet in the other room kept grabbing my attention because it had a piece of black cloth in it. Finally, I tried to keep myself focused, and it was going well until a gentleman in the group got bored and decided to go out into the hall. I watched him leave, thinking that it was very rude and should come back. For some reason, when he left, I noted that the sun was in a position that didn't cast a shadow of the man's head on the hallway wall. Once again, I turned my attention back to the guide, but the man in the hallway began to wander in the hall, and that distracted me. When I turned to watch the man, there was suddenly a very clear and defined silhouette of a man's head and shoulders with a bearded face that traveled across the wall, then just disappeared. It startled me at first. Then I got excited because I thought I must have seen a ghost. Then I thought, no, I have to be practical about this because that man is out in the hallway. Once the tour guide was done talking, I went outside into the hallway way. The first thing I noticed was that any shadow from the tourists on the wall wasn't that dark or defined. Then I noticed that the way the sun was facing caused the shadows to be cast on a completely different wall. The silhouette I saw couldn't have been from anyone on the tour. Then I noticed that there was an upstairs where I thought maybe an employee could be working. That theory was completely dismissed when it appeared no one was up there. There wasn't any logical explanations for the silhouette. It wasn't until my family returned home a few days later that I decided to research what I had seen. After discovering that there was a frequent spirit there that was called the General, I made the connection. The details from past eyewitness accounts were identical to mine. He stands out on the porch, has a Civil War uniform on, and has a beard on his face. I was, and still am convinced, that I saw the General on that day. This took place shortly after I had turned 16. My dad was working up in Oregon and Washington, but was based out of Rainier. I went up to live with him, I guess just to do something different. I was used to being around the city type of atmosphere, and it wasn't too long before I grew bored. Not that the Oregon country girls in that area didn't stir my blood. It's just that they mainly wanted to waste their time getting high or drunk, tipping cows, or shooting the passing ships going down the Columbia River, which I don't mind. I just miss the city lights or something. Anywho, I'd been out partying with a friend and drove off the side of a mountain, another story which would take a while to go through, and I thought my dad was probably going to kill me anyway, without benefit of blindfold and a last smoke, so I decided to hitchhike back to Oklahoma. Needless to say, I lacked understanding of just how far I was from Oklahoma.
My newfound compadre decided to go along because he had gotten in recent trouble with his folks and wanted out of town too, so we took off. Somewhere between Portland and the Dells, on I-84, which was only a 2-lane at that spot. We were really tired and looking for a place to sleep. By this time, I'd found out that this hitchhiking thing wasn't for me, and it really should be called a lot of hiking and not enough hitching, or something similar. And what seemed weird was that out in the middle of nowhere, the fences were really well kept, and I didn't want to get caught up climbing one. No houses, no anything. It was simply just nice fences. Anyway, we found a rather peevish-looking fence about 3/4 of a mile before a bend in the road. The moon was out and actually lit up the area pretty well. There was about 3/4 of a mile behind us from the last turn in the road, and like I said, about the same in front of us before the next one. We were in a valley or whatever they're called that the road went through, and it was really a beautiful sight. Just as we were fixing to jump the fence, a car came around the bend from in front. Of course it was too far off to see us when it rounded the bend, but we didn't want it to see us climbing the fence when it came abreast of us, like the owners of the land are out cruising in the middle of the night. The sides of the road in that area sloped down at a very sharp right and were gravel, at least on our side of the road, so you didn't have to go far to be below the grade of the road and out of sight of passing motorists. It went down probably 15 feet though, well below the road. Come to think of it, I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that since. Just as we were sliding down the slope out of sight, I caught sight of something way down the road, just the side of the curve. The lights of the oncoming car caught it, just as it was making the curve. Whatever it was, went down the embankment on the opposite side of the road from us. I asked my friend if he saw it, and he said yes, he saw something. After the car passed, we peeked over the top of the road, and right when we started to climb back onto the roadway, because we decided we didn't want to sleep in that area anyway, we saw what appeared to be 2 guys pushing a motorbike climb up where we saw it go off before. This was still about 3/4 of a mile at least off, down the hill near the curve. We slid back down the slope, out of sight. I really don't know why. Then we kinda just looked at each other. A motorbike? We both looked at the incline behind us. If you pushed a motorbike off the side of the road down this embankment, you'd have a heck of a time stopping it before it went all the way down, and the river was on their side, and even a harder time getting back up. I couldn't imagine trying to get it back up to the road, assuming it didn't go into the river. We both peeked over the top, breathing really quiet and shallow, watching for another couple of minutes, when all of a sudden, it stood up. It wasn't 2 guys pushing a motorbike. It was something that had been on all fours and stood up, and it was huge. At least twice as tall as us, and by the way, we weren't midgets. I almost crapped myself. I started looking around, and the fence, by this time, was looking mighty small. Thinking really fast in that fight or flight mode, and the flight was definitely the way I was leaning towards, I realized that, thank God it had been his turn to carry the backpack, which would slow him down, and had the only food we had in it, and on top of that, I thought I could outrun him. Maybe it wouldn't want both of us. I looked at him, saw the panic in his eyes, and knew he was thinking along the same lines. I knew I couldn't run. I also knew that I had to sense us when it got directly across from us. I pulled out my little pocket knife. I knew that we're going to die, and all I could think of was, Lord, please let it be quick. I peeked over the top again, and it was almost even with us. I might have whimpered, silently of course, but I also noticed that the wind was blowing in my face from his direction. There might be hope. We ducked back down, and we could hear it almost stop right across from us for a moment or two, then start on up the road again. It was almost to the curve up the hill from us from the direction we had originally came from, when another car came around the bend downhill. I thought about jumping out in front of it and yelling for help, but if it didn't stop, then whatever that was would know that we were there. We waited, and it disappeared below the other side of the road, like before when the other car came. This time, it didn't come back up. I don't know how long we waited, but we finally climbed back up and continued down the hill and around the curve. We didn't say a word or breath, anything about a whisper, till we cleared that bend in the road and was a mile or two away. When we called the Dallas, we called our parents to come and get us. We'd had enough of the open road in Oregon. I don't know what that was, but I still think about it sometimes. I've had a few other things happen to me in my life, but that really scared me. My boyfriend and I saw the state park on our way from Arkansas to Illinois and thought we should check it out. We'd never heard of this place or even seen it before. We parked in the parking area and got out of the car to explore the woods. Naturally, I had to use the restroom, so I went to the bathroom, and once I got to the toilet, I had a terrible feeling of being watched, and I truly felt like someone was in the bathroom with me, but obviously, I was the only one. The feeling of this presence was so unbearing and evil that I ran out of the bathroom the second I finished with my pants down. Once I got out of the bathroom, my boyfriend and I started down the path. Within 30 seconds of walking, and still within 30 feet of the bathroom, my boyfriend and I heard a loud footstep, crunching the leaves. In fact, it was multiple footsteps. My boyfriend thought it was a bear or something, because of the heftiness of the steps, so he was searching and searching for a bear, or anything, but he couldn't find a thing. I didn't mention the bathroom to him, but after not too long, I insisted we continue. I know there is something terribly evil in that bathroom. For a while, nothing else odd occurred, and we continued on the path which goes down to level ground, with a large lake on one side. But soon after we got to this level ground area, the sun started settling, and that's when things got uneasy again. We both started to hear something large walking in the leaves again. Sean, my boyfriend, really wanted to see what it was, and at this point, I felt like we were really in danger, and that something else, unnatural, was there. So we barely started to move farther into the woods when Sean told me he saw a shadow or something farther in. Then, I was done. I told him we had to go, and I cannot be here any longer. So, I ran like hell back to the car, and Sean was close behind me. Once we got to the car, I was at the passenger door, ready for him to unlock it. And of course, he tells me that he hears that thing we've been hearing in the sparsely wooded area, directly in front of the parking lot, which is to the very right near the parking lot, and that he has to see what it is. So, I had him throw me the keys, and I got in the car. He got in within a minute, and I asked him if he saw anything, and he said he just saw that a dark shadow moved behind a tree, but nothing else. Needless to say, we booked it off that mountain, and it really seemed like a car was trying to chase us down the mountain. But we may have just been super spooked from the woods experience we just had. But I will note, we were driving at about 65 miles an hour, and the speed limit was way less. I forget now what it was specifically, but I want to say between 30 and 40 max. Plus, it was a mountain road, and very windy, and frankly, difficult to traverse at 65. Also, during the time I was taking pictures, the whole time we were in the woods, nature shots, that was actually the entire reason we were there in the first place, and the pictures were neat. The day ones didn't have orbs, but but the night ones all did. And I thought maybe it was from the lake reflection or something. But I took a picture out of the car window at the moon right after we got in the car, and in that photo, there's the moon and like 30 orbs. It's amazing to me. I mean, I've never taken any orb photo ever before, and I took another photo of the moon out my window about 30 minutes after we left the mountain, and only the moon. I did some research to find anything on the area. It seems it was established in an old Indian burial ground, but few findings on much else, and I never found anything on cars chasing you out of this place. Be careful. During the day, the bathroom is really the worst part, and seemingly off the trail, but I just wouldn't go at night. And also, Sean didn't seem to have the feelings as intensely as I did, so if you're the right person, the feeling might not be too overwhelming. I was thinking about my dog last night, as he was put away a few years ago, and the immediate remembrance of a very weird experience me and my dog had in my home in Tallahassee. This home, prior to any construction behind us, was all wooded landscape and ran into Lake Jackson. Within this wooded area were several Indian burial mounds. One day, shortly after I moved there for a new job, I took my dog for a walk, unleashed, back in the woods. I saw those mounds, but really did not know that they were Indian burial mounds. My dog and I both walked over these mounds just being adventurers. When I returned from our walk, my neighbor asked me jokingly if I let my dog run loose back there, and my response was yes. He then stated that I would see a black bird perched somewhere soon in a tree close by, and that this bird would be watching me. I laughingly asked why, and he said that if we walked over those mounds, we would have possibly wakened the spirits, and that the bird was their watchful eye on me. Well, of course I thought this man was crazy, but he was actually a very nice and intelligent man, as I learned later. So only about 2 days later, I returned home from work, and I recall thinking about the black bird Betty told me. So I peeked around the left side of the home to look into the wooded area, and lo and behold, there was a blackbird perched on a tree, staring at me. He would not take his eyes off either. Needless to say, that was creepy. So that very night, I was in my office, and my dog was usually laying in the living room by the fireplace. As I was doing my work in the office, my office chair was budged about 2 to 3 inches forward with a force that felt like someone actually pushed the chair. I instinctively reached by, looking over my right side, expecting to see my dog. No dog, nothing. So I quickly went into the living room, only to see my dog laying down facing the hallway entrance, which is where my office resided, as well as 2 other bedrooms. And he had his head between his paws, staring and growling at something in the hallway. Talk about getting freaked out. So I grabbed my dog by his collar and tried to lead him down into the hallway, and he resisted every attempt. He was scared, obviously, and he definitely saw or sensed something. I did not see anything at all. As I walked into each room through that hallway, I did not see or sense anything. Then I walked into the bathroom in the master bedroom to find that my candle, which was lit, went out. So that night, I kept all lights on. The following day I came home and looked again for that weird bird. He was not there. So I took my dog outside to do his thing, but then noticed he was limping. Then he fell to his side with pain in the backyard. As I made the observation, I noticed that in his groin area, he had a large tumor-like bulge coming from this area. I immediately took him to the veterinarian, and I recall she had no explanation for it, but prescribed medication to reduce the swelling. Within 2 weeks or so, the swelling went away. Looking back at that, I really feel that the spirit, or whatever it was, made that happen, as my dog was still young and very healthy. After that week of weird occurrences, I never had anything further happen. I never told my neighbor what had happened, as I did not want to look silly or have rumors flying around. But for sure, I can tell you that I know in my own gut that what that neighbor told me came to life. Dogs can definitely sense or see these spirits, as we cannot apparently. Between the bird, the bump on my chair, my dog growling and acting scared, and the bulge in his groin area, all made sense that something was in that house. Never walked in those woods again. I no longer reside there either. This is a ghost, entity, evil demon spirit, and whatever else was haunting our home, I can tell you, I will never forget what happened as long as I breathe air. We moved into this big house when I was 15. It had been empty for about 10 years. It had old, creaky wood floors and a ton of doors. Everywhere you turned in the house, there was a door. Don't ask, I still can't figure it out. It was a doctor's house. In the very back of the house is where he saw his patients. Yes, some died in the house in his office. Both my grandparents also died there. The very first thought we had activity, about 3 a.m. in the morning, there was someone banging on our front door. My grandfather would get up, and no one would be there. This happened all the time. We'd drop our car keys in the glass bowl right when we walked in, and they would be in a different part of the house. Things were always showing up all over the house. It likes to play tricks all the time. So many things happened, I can hardly recall them, all but this one I will never forget in my life. I would love to forget it, but it just won't go away. I was 20 years old and just had a baby. I had my daughter in a bassinet beside my bed. I fell asleep watching Michael Jordan play basketball in the Olympics. My bed had a tall headboard that sat up against my bedroom window. I also had floor-to-ceiling curtains, very heavy curtains. The windows were shut. The curtains were shut too. I was sleeping on my back as I fell asleep to the TV. The TV was still on, and the baby was fast asleep. All of a sudden, I felt a strong man's hand covering my whole face. He was trying to suffocate me. I was in panic mode. His grip on my face and nose was so tight that I couldn't breathe or scream. I was looking up at the ceiling thinking I'm gonna die, right there, right now. It seemed like an eternity, and I was losing my breath. Then, the phone beside my bed rang. It stopped. I jumped so far out of the bed across the room and looked back thinking I was fighting off an intruder, and no one was there. I looked out the window. Nothing. I looked in the mirror, and I had a bright red handprint on my face. It was evil. It was an evil something. I was praying out loud for whatever it was to get the hell out of my house and leave me alone. I've never been that terrified in my life. Never. I looked out the window, and it was pitch black. I got the feeling like something was out there laughing at me, or mocking me. The baby never woke up. It was her father on the phone. I told him what happened, but he thought it was a dream. I know from the start it was as real as I'm sitting here telling you today. Not long after that, my grandmother and grandfather died in the house on 2 separate occasions. I was left in this huge house all alone with my 2 children. They were 1 and just months old. The house was always freezing, no matter how high the heat was on. I would hear talking that I could never make out. Footsteps up and down the hallway, pinching, grabbing. The lights never worked. I changed the bulbs all the time. When I did the laundry where the old doctor's office used to be, I could feel a breath on my neck. I could see shadows of people out of the corner of my eye. It was a living nightmare. The energy was so thick and heavy, even on the brightest day. I was scared to death to be there alone and go home after work alone. I would just sit up with the TV on until I could fall asleep and pray to God that I didn't have to go to pee in the night. I was so scared to get up. The day I moved from that house was the happiest day of my life. I could have stayed there forever in that big house, but I wanted out. I still to this day, 19 years later, have vivid dreams of what happened. All the things I heard and all the things I saw. I've only told a few people this story. I've seen and felt both good and evil from a very, very young age. My nanny told me I had the gift of seeing and hearing spirits, like I was a light to them. I've had so many experiences I can't count. Most are very bad, but I have a couple that are good. I'm terrified of the afterlife. I pray that God carries me to heaven. If you don't believe, I'm telling you, there are things you can't see, but they can hurt you and make you so depressed you want to die. They can touch you, hurt you, and mock you, and laugh in your face. I know. Here's my story. It will be interesting to see what everyone else thinks of all this. I was at a friend's house listening to music tonight, Saturday, April 12th. He's a drinker, so he was feeling pretty good. He was at the computer with his back to me. I was on the couch directly in front of the TV, which was off. The only light on was right above the computer desk. To my right was the entryway, which was dark, pitch black actually, but I could see the reflection of the room in the TV. He was playing "Oh Death" from "Brother Where Art Thou." Song itself gave me the creeps, when suddenly I looked into the TV and saw a solid black figure of a tall man start to step out of the darkness of the entryway and into the living room. I didn't see anything like clothing or facial features, just tall and solid black. My friend at the same time swiveled his desk chair and pointed towards the entryway where he saw the figure. The figure stepped back into the dark as quickly as it appeared, as though it didn't want him to see it. I looked at him and said, "Did you see that too?" To which he replied, "See what?" He was only being animated during the song, but for sure didn't see anything. I've experienced several things at this house. He has not though, and it upsets him. But what I experienced that evening was the most eerie and frightening thing for sure. I know it wasn't one of his friends, or someone goofing off. It isn't easy to walk into his house, through the front door, and not be heard. The floor is tile. We walked over and turned on the light, and we both looked. There was no one there. I just went home. I couldn't stay there, and I begged him to come with me, but he wouldn't. A few days later when we talked, I asked him if he had ever had any seances or similar things in the house. He had first said no because it was his grandma's house, and he moved in about a year after she had passed. But then he paused, and then he said, "Well, remember when we cleaned out the attic? There was a Ouija board up there." Well, no, I didn't remember, and I told him to get his house cleansed, but he was just laughing at me. I've never been back to his house since that night. About 2 weeks later, he got an unintentional EVP, which is very eerie also. He has a voice-activated recorder and was recording a couple of programs off the computer for a friend at work. He turned off the computer and the TV isn't hooked up anyways, but when he woke up, there were 3 recordings instead of 2 on the recorder. I know he's pretty up on computers, but he didn't make this EVP himself. Actually, it scared him, and he said he wasn't going to listen to it anymore.
Even though I'm not sure whether I do in fact believe in ghosts and the supernatural, I must be the ghost stories world's biggest fan and relentless reader, and have been a patron of your site for many, many years, at least a decade now. Like I said, not being totally sure whether I do actually believe in ghosts, I've never had a story of my own contribute to a website. However, over the past months, possibly years, certain things have happened in our current rented home. Occurrences in this house that made me think twice, maybe even 3 times about what I actually do and don't believe in. My husband Craig and I have been living in our rented home here in Melbourne, Australia for almost 4 years now. We rent privately and know very little about the house and its history, apart from the fact that we are private renters and the rent has always been almost ridiculously cheap. The house isn't that old, however. It would only be about 15 or 20 years old. We do know, however, that several of the last tenants that lived here, families with children, by the look of the wall drawings in the study and backyard, moved out fairly quick after moving in, which has always puzzled me, as the house isn't in that bad a shape. The neighborhood is okay, and the rent, like I said, has always been ridiculously cheap. Any questionable incident that has happened in this house has either taken place in the lounge room or the nursery. My daughter is now 3 months short of turning 3. I remember one time when my daughter was tiny. She would have been 6 months old at the time. We'd put her to bed in her cot in her room. She's always been a fire alarm screamer, and on this particular day, after screaming for about 10 minutes, she quite suddenly stopped dead. Assuming that she had just fallen asleep, I walked outside into the backyard about 10 minutes later to feed the dog. I looked through her window subtly to make sure that all was calm in her room, when I noticed a very strange thing. My daughter did not look close to sleeping at all. She was in fact staring intently at the ceiling. I watched her eyes move from left to right and so forth, as if she was watching something very closely, but there was nothing there. Not thinking all that much of it, I went back inside and continued on with whatever I was doing, thinking that she was just boring herself off to sleep. A few weeks later, something very similar happened to this again, except this time, it was in the lounge room. Heidi was sitting with me on the couch. The family dog was also in the room, sitting by my feet, as Heidi all of a sudden started staring at the ceiling again, with much the same intensity as before in her room. This time, the dog joined in and was making much the same eye and head movements as Heidi was, as if they were both watching something on the ceiling move from side to side. The dog's hair then stood on the back of its neck, and he started growling, which frightened me, as he is one of the friendliest dogs in the world and wouldn't hurt a fly. Then, being a bit of a wimp, he got up and snuck into the next room and didn't come back for about a half an hour. This sort of thing has happened about 3 or 4 times since then, but nothing besides this has ever happened either. No apparitions or noises or banging. I've sometimes had the feeling, though, that we are not alone here. Nothing like this ever happens when my husband is at home, only when I am alone or with Heidi. A couple of days ago, it happened again. Heidi started off by staring at the ceiling, and then her gaze diverted to her toy basket in the corner of the room. She looked at me, smiled, looked back at the toy basket, pointed, and yelled, "Baby." The word baby doesn't necessarily mean baby to Heidi. She calls newborns babies, as well as toddlers up to about her own age. I asked her, "Where, Heidi? Where is the baby?" "There," she persisted. "There, baby." I shrugged and looked away again, and hoped to dear God that she would stop pointing and looking at that darn toy basket. She did, thankfully, after only about a minute or so this time. What do you honestly think about this? Fluke? Or something more than just imaginative child playfulness? This website has mentioned dark, powerful energies such as imps, and I noticed the creator of this website has seen what could be called imps. Imps are described as devil spirits, who are demons, and small in stature. I've had many experiences throughout my life like the one the web creator had growing up. I don't like talking about them so much, and do my best to keep it dormant, but I did read their story, and I've had an experience with a small black figure that sounds like one of the imps described in that story. Me, my daughter, and my wife all used to sleep in the same bed till our little girl was 1.5 years old. Around the time my daughter was that age, I remember staying up till close to 1 or 2 a.m. watching a long movie. When I was finished, I went to the room and turned on the bathroom light to brush my teeth. Our room was well lit from the bathroom. Since around the age of 3, I've had dealings with spirits as well. So, when I was about halfway through my brushing, I pretty much knew from that feeling I had that something was happening. I looked in the room where my daughter and wife were sleeping, and called from behind my daughter in a fetal position was a small black figure. It looked human, but it moved, behaved, and felt like it was something else. It looked towards me, got on all fours, and scurried across the bed lightning fast. I kinda jumped back, but it disappeared when it hit the floor. The strange thing was, after I got into bed, my daughter, eyes closed, still asleep, did the exact same thing the figure did before I went to bed. Only my daughter stopped with her still sleeping face right in mine, then laid back down, and was normal again. Some other things started happening after that, but I don't know if they're related. I hope my story helps you figure out what these things are. My story begins about 3 years ago. I was 27, and me and my husband were expecting our first child. We had been living with his mother, but since I had become pregnant, we needed a place of our own. My parents owned 2 houses, one in which they lived in, and the other right behind theirs. My oldest brother and wife and children used to live there, but he bought the house right next door to my parents. Always wanted to stay close to our family. We're very close. Now that the house behind my parents was unoccupied, my mother asked me to move in. My husband and I gladly accepted. We would have more room and a place of our own. Well, the very next day we moved in, I was about 41 weeks pregnant and needed to go to the hospital to be induced for labor. We had a healthy baby boy. After our stay in the hospital, we returned to our new home. About 4 to 6 weeks after we moved in, I started hearing a noise in the middle of the night, coming from the closet in our bedroom. My husband worked a graveyard shift most nights at the time, so I was alone at night with our son a lot. The noise was that of the closet door opening. I had put a long rectangular mirror on the closet door, those that are about 1 foot wide and 4 feet long. It had 2 hooks that went over the top of the door, so as to hang the mirror. So every time you opened it, it would screech very loudly, since the metal hooks rubbed against the door frame. Well, like I said, about 4 to 6 weeks after we moved in, I heard this very loud screech at about 2:30 to 3 a.m. I woke up and realized it was the closet door opening. It opened about 4 inches. We had 2 chinchillas that slept on the floor at the end of the bed, and I just rationalized it to one of them opening the door with their paw. But I know that would have to take some effort, since the metal hooks over the top of the door made it hard to open, and would make the door get stuck. I didn't really get scared. I just looked, then went back to sleep. About 2 weeks later, again, me asleep, alone, middle of the night. Then the screeching sound of the closet door opening. I woke up, and this time sat up and looked at the closet door. What just happened? I checked on my baby in his bassinet next to my bed, and he was fast asleep. I looked at the chinchillas. They were awakened too, and looking at the closet door, but had not moved. So again, I felt no fright and went back to sleep. Again, a few weeks later, my husband had a day off, so he was home that night. And again, about 2 or 3 a.m., the screeching noise of this closet door being pushed open from the inside. My husband wakes up and just stares at the door. Now he saw firsthand what I had told him about. The last time this happened was some weeks after that. Again, I was alone at night. I heard the screeching sound of the door opening, only it sounded like it opened a little bit wider than just 4 inches this time. I sat up and looked at the door. The chihuahuas were staring at the closet door as well. This time, they stood up. Then the closet door started opening a little bit further still. That set the chihuahuas off. One was barking at the closet door like there was no tomorrow, and the other ran under the bed crying and howling. Their reaction is what scared me the most. My heart was racing. I put my head under the covers. The closet door didn't open further, but it took me forever to get back to sleep. After that night, I was scared of the closet. I told my husband, and he put a lock on the door. I closed it and locked it every night. I didn't open it again. Only one thing happened after that. About a year later, the closet door became increasingly harder to close. It would get stuck, and I would really have to push to close it completely. One Sunday night, about 7:30 p.m. this time, I again was home alone. My husband was working, and my son was with my parents in the house in front of ours. I was watching some TV, and I didn't like to leave the closet door open anymore. So I walked over to the closet door to try and close it completely. I was really pushing, and I started banging on the door with my fist to try and close it. It was almost closed. Then, while I was banging with my fist, right on the other side of the door there was a loud bang, as if someone hit it with their fist. It was right on the spot I was hitting it. I could feel the vibration against me. I stepped away from the closet door. I tried to stay calm. I'll try to sit down and watch some TV, I told myself. I sat down, but could not keep my eyes off the closet door. After about 30 seconds, I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I left my parents' house in front of mine and left the TV on. Why did that scare me so much? I was fine when the closet door would open in the middle of the night. Was it because I was so sleep deprived from having an infant son that it was so easy for me to go back to sleep? The fact that I heard the banging on either side of the closet unnerved me so much. Thinking back, I remembered when I was 14 and my brother first moved in the very same house with my then 4-month pregnant sister-in-law and her 4-month-old daughter from a previous marriage. I remember shortly after they moved in, her telling me she thought the house was haunted. I asked why, and she told me that at night, she would see the closet doorknob rattle and turn. Oh, it's just her imagination, I told her. Even at 14, I would rationalize everything. I guess it wasn't her imagination after all. I later asked my niece, now 21, if she ever saw anything. She told me she did, which I later write about. This is something completely different to my experience, and I think it had something to do with her, and not the house. She also used to tell me that the closet door used to open in front of my brother until he confronted it. Then it stopped. Thank you for taking the time to read my story. I live about 20 minutes from an old covered bridge in Mableton, Georgia. This is one of the places I've been to in the surrounding area and where I had the most happen. In 2004, we went on a last-minute hunt to the bridge. I know you're supposed to be better prepared, but I kept most of my things in the car at all times, just in case. We of course had heard the local legends and wanted to see for ourselves, so we headed down after about midnight. Even then, the traffic on the road was just heavy enough that we were unable to try the chocolate thing with the car, so we parked up the road a ways away at the Comet Trail parking lot. We walked down and took our flashlights with us. On either side of the bridge are orange streetlights, so the bridge is lit up all the way through. One in the group brought her cousin, and I didn't realize at first that he had been drinking, or he would have stayed behind. He got up in one of the bridge's windows and peed into the creek below. After yelling at him to stop, I realized I could no longer see the lights on either side of the bridge. Our flashlights also stopped working, all of them. After the temperature dropped and it became dark the way it did, I told others it was time to leave. We then saw the streetlights turn on for a second, and then in the distance, at the other end of the bridge, two kids dressed in formal attire, standing and hand-holding. Had to be about 30 seconds, but we saw it. We froze, then started back to the car. As we walked out of the bridge, we heard what sounded like little kids laughing, and they actually touched and poked at our backs as we hurried as fast as we could back up the hill. One of our group reported hearing a voice in his ear telling him to run. I have to say it was unsettling, and though I haven't been back to the bridge yet, it hasn't stopped me from going to other places. I've heard voices and gotten pics, and even had things happen at other sites. This one was one of the best ones, because I don't get physically touched by them often. I also believe nothing would have happened if he had not upset the spirits the way he did. I'm very much more careful about who I bring with now. Only one town over from our home stands one of the largest and most ornate railway stations in our state. The owners worked over 20 years bringing it back from neglect in a time gone by, as their second love is antiques. They have decorated it with period pieces throughout, now opened it as an outstanding restaurant. My husband and I often bring friends there to enjoy not only the wonderful food, but for the pleasure of watching them jump as the Amtrak fly by, only feet from the window. There is a very small organ that has been placed on a wall, not far from where we often sit. Several meals ago, our waitress entertained us by telling some people have commented there is a ghost attached to this instrument. One said she saw a very small, frail old lady standing by it, saying this isn't right, indicating dismay as to how our organ came to be sitting in an eatery. The waitress went on to say they never like to work alone when closing up, as there's so many unexplained noises. We enjoyed a meal there today, and as always, our conversation turned into the many thousands of people now gone that pass through these massive arched doors. Out of nowhere, I smelled a very strong odor of ivory soap. Mind you, we are eating fish, no one is passing by, and the other tables haven't changed their patrons. I say nothing, but a moment later, my husband smells it and says how weird it is. Such an uncommon smell today. It lasted for about 3 minutes. There was no explaining the smell. As we finish, we wander through the hall looking at various rail-related antiques and move on to the outside. There's an Amtrak train on the track, but it is going slow. Strange, as they usually are speeding enough for an onlooker to feel their wind as they pass, heading for Boston. It comes to a complete stop at the station. A man in uniform gets out and looks at the front and then under. Turning to us, he says he thought he saw someone laying on the track. He walks about, making a full inspection. Then he gets in and then starts going. We see the riders in their seats, but as we watch, he stops again, just down the track, and repeats the inspection again. Strange day. This place should be investigated. This is my second entry and story. This takes place in Rusk, Texas in the 70s. This story comes from an acquaintance of mine, who is really more of a good friend of mine, of my good friends. Mike and Katie were married and had 2 children. One was a 9-year-old boy, and the other was a 5-year-old girl. They moved into a house that had a shotgun-style layout. In other words, you entered into the living room, and there was a straight hallway all the way to the back door, with all of the rooms off of this one main hallway. Mike and Katie took the first door on the right as their bedroom, while giving the children the last door on the left to their bedroom. One night, not long after the move, Mike and his wife were sound asleep when they were awakened by screams of Mommy and Daddy, and turned on the nightstand lamp to find both their children wide awake and terrified. The children claimed to have seen a man with a hat on and a beard peering into their window. Mike immediately got his gun and ran around the back, where he found an empty field and no sign of anyone having been there. At first, they were under the impression that this man had a ladder, because the back of the house stood on a steep grade down, and no one could be peering into one of the back windows without a ladder. But the occurrence repeated itself, and finally, Mommy asked the kids to describe exactly what they had seen. Their stories were both told at different sessions, and matched completely. What had woken the children was a strange light out the window, and someone walking up and down on what sounded like wood boards. They said this man leaned over and looked down into the window, and he had a shotgun in his hands. The couple moved the children to another room, and Mike did some laborious digging into the history and county files in the house. Through newspapers and files, plus some additional info from some of the older townspeople, Mike learned that this house had once been at another location, and when it was moved, it was turned around so that what had been the front of the house was now the back of the house. He also learned that the man who had died at the house had been arrested and died in prison for shooting his wife and her lover in their bed with a shotgun. I've sent in one other story about my mother's house in Illinois, but I have 2 more stories to share. I was raised by my grandparents. Their house has its share of odd occurrences. Knocking sounds from within the walls, an apparition of my great-grandmother, and eerie feelings down the long hallway to the bedrooms. One night, I was around 9 in 1989. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. My bed was facing the doorway, and I could see into my grandparents' bedroom across the hall. The hall is only about 4 feet wide. The only light visible came from a small night light in the outlet at the center of the hall. As I was tossing and turning, trying to fall asleep, I looked out into the hallway and saw a young woman with curly hair, her body glowing faintly. She carried a candle in her cupped hands. She walked slowly and paused for a second and turned to look into my grandparents' room. Being the nervous child I was, I quickly pulled the covers over my head and ignored it, eventually falling asleep. Years passed, and I never saw another apparition. When I was 16, 1996, I was still living there. I grew up in that house, 13 years total, and had moved across the hall, having switched rooms with my grandparents. I decided I would try an experiment. I found a dress similar to the one I saw the apparition wearing, so I decided I would put it on and sort of relive that experience. I have very curly hair, and it was the same length as the apparitions. I put on the dress, grabbed a short white candle, turned off the hall light, lit the candle, and took the path that I had witnessed the apparition take. I took the same route, made the slow walk, paused at my old bedroom door, looked in, and walked into what was now my bedroom. Was what I saw a ghost, or merely a glimpse into my future? Was I seeing myself on some other intersecting point of time? I'm still trying to figure that one out. Next story. This occurred in 1997, while I was at a Native American ceremony in the woods in Nebraska. We had been out in the woods for about a week, living in our tents and teepees. Ceremonies going on throughout that time. I'd heard the stories of spirits who lived in the trees, and being as curious as I am about the supernatural, I was nervous and excited to see what might be out there. For the first few days, things were normal, and I went about my business working in the cook shack, making large quantities of food for the huge number of people there. One evening, after dinner, I was sitting at a table with the aider, talking about the name he had just given me, Star Woman, for my love of looking at the stars for hours on end, when my right hand suddenly went ice cold. My mother was sitting to my left, and I said, "Wow," my hand just went freezing cold. There was no wind, and it was July in Nebraska, pretty hot, even after the sun went down. She said, "Oh, don't worry, that's just the spirit touching you." I can't recall the name for them, so I'll just say spirit. I think it was Wayne Guy, but I'm not sure. Okay, no big deal. Our tent was set up along the perimeter of the tree line, with an outhouse about 50 feet to the right. On several occasions, while walking to the outhouse, I noticed black human forms in the trees. When I'd shine my flashlight on them, they were gone. I attributed this to my imagination. A few days later, a friend who had brought along for the trip was sitting in my tent with me, talking about the day. I was on the left side, leaning back on my arms, with my lantern flashlight next to my left hand, about 12 inches away. It was the kind where you could pull up the body of the flashlight to reveal a lantern. We were talking, and we noticed the light shifting in the tent. There were no other lights, aside from a bonfire on the side of the camp at about 300 feet. I looked at my flashlight, and it was standing on its edge. All we could do was sit and watch it. It stood on its edge for about 2 minutes. Then we decided to leave the tent for a while, because we were a bit freaked out. The flashlight had a rounded head, not a square one. My hand did cause the tent floor to dent in slightly, but my flashlight was nowhere near my hand or the dent I made in the floor. The light was literally standing on one rounded edge. When I mentioned it to my mom the next day, she quipped, "They were playing with you. They must like you." I wasn't really scared, just a bit nervous, considering we were out in the wilderness with no lights. I was intrigued more than anything. Considering the nature of the ceremony we were attending, I'm certain the spirits were focused by our activity. I hope to return to that spot in the future. This occurred in Miami, Florida in 1980 when I was 15. I still don't know if this was a paranormal experience, but it was unsettling nevertheless. I was babysitting for the next door neighbors one evening. Their daughter was down for bed, and I was in the family room watching TV. They had a small anchor biter type dog, and it went to the double sliding glass doors that led out into the rear patio and pool area, like it wanted to go to the bathroom. All of the homes in this area had a screened-in patio pool enclosure, and when you open the sliding glass door to step out into the patio, immediately to your left was a screen door that led into the backyard. Unlike most of the homes in my neighborhood though, the backyard was surrounded by a chain link fence. So I go and open the sliding glass door, which was completely covered by trays for privacy, to let the dog out. The dog steps out, and I immediately hear the crunching of grass in the yard to my left, as though someone is walking in the backyard. Startled, I look to my left, and there is what appears to be a man, adult size, reaching out as if to open the screen door. I immediately slammed the glass sliding door shut, scared out of my wits. I stood frozen in fear in the living room. Silence. After a few minutes, I cautiously peered through the curtain onto the patio. No one there, just a dog sniffing around. I let the dog in, and he did not appear agitated at the least. I never thought much about it after that, until years later. If there was someone there, why didn't the dog bark? If it was supernatural, animals are known to get agitated, yet nothing. My imagination? Definitely not. Nothing like that ever occurred again in subsequent babysitting for that neighbor. Hey guys, so first things first. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. I hate begging, but that's the way the algorithm works these days. It's not going to put me into the algorithm unless you put like, unless you comment. But comment anyway, because I love the way you guys write. I don't know what I'm saying. But yeah, I mean it. Obviously, guys, love you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. And oh, I forgot to say share.